Test, 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 test.
The hearing will come to order, and this is the first hearing of the year for our subcommittee. Welcome to all our returning subcommittee members. Glad to have you back. A warm welcome to our subcommittee's newest member, Mr. Mahdi. He's not here yet. He's down at the end, but we look forward to having him work with us. Today, the subcommittee is going to hear from two panels. We're going to hear about the activities and the operations of the Internal Revenue Service. Our witness for the first panel is IRS Commissioner John Koskinen. Welcome to you, sir. We appreciate your return to federal service, and we thank you for taking on this responsibility, which I think we'd all agree is a difficult time. Our second panel of witnesses are Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration Russell George, and National Taxpayer Advocate Nina Olson. Mr. George is a regular witness for the subcommittee, and we appreciate his careful and constant oversight of the IRS. We've not heard in some time from Ms. Olson, so we are especially eager to hear from her. Now, as a matter of housekeeping, I'm going to be following the 5-minute rule for the members, and I don't plan on cutting anybody off in the middle of their sentence, but if everybody could keep their questions and comments when we get to that part of the program to 5 minutes, that'll give us a chance to hear from everybody and have maybe more than one round of questions. I'm going to recognize the members in order of seniority, those that were here when the gavel went down, and for the latecomers, we will recognize them based on their arrival, and we'll go back and forth between the parties. Now, I think most of you know that the 2014 appropriation cycle tested our endurance. It was only after the fiscal year had started and after we had a government shutdown did the Budget Committee come to an agreement on the discretionary spending. And once we had that agreement enacted, we rolled up our sleeves, we went to work very quickly, got a bipartisan omnibus appropriations bill enacted, and thanks in no small part to our distinguished chairman, Mr. Rogers, who's here with us today. And so we hope that this year is going to go a little more smoothly because we've already got an agreement on the total discretionary spending that's in place, and so we can have regular order. And by that I mean the way we are supposed to work, that we'll mark up our bills, we'll subject them to amendments at the full committee and on the House floor, and then we'll conference them with the Senate. Now, the administration hadn't submitted their budget for 2015 yet, and we'll have that soon, and we've invited the commissioner to come back probably in April to talk about how much money, his wants and his needs. Today, this is an oversight hearing, and that really gets into how. How do you spend the money that you've been appropriated? The how much will come a little bit later. But I would suggest that the two are very interrelated because how you spend the money that you have impacts how much money you'll receive in the future. And I think that we all know that you've come to the IRS in what would be described as a difficult time. Some would say you inherited a pretty big mess. We've had a situation that I would say it's one of the dark periods in the IRS history. You had at a time when the IRS was awash with money, their horseplay harassment started. Lavish conferences were held, millions of dollars were wasted, silly videos were made, and that was not good for anybody. At the same time, we found out the IRS was singling out individuals, groups of individuals, subjecting them to harassment, to intimidation, bullying, if you will, in an effort, it seemed, to shut down their involvement in politics. And that's what you inherited. And also probably inherited an agency that wasn't doing a very good job of dealing with the consumer, the folks that call the IRS and have questions. And so when your predecessor was sitting in the chair you're sitting in, I asked him at a hearing like this, do you think the IRS has betrayed the trust of the American people? And he said yes. He said, but I want to try to help rebuild that trust. And I'm sure that one of your goals as the new guy, as the new commissioner, is to rebuild the trust that's been lost with not only in some part with this committee, the American people, and that's what you're about. And I must tell you that some of the decisions that you've made early on are of some concern to me as you try to rebuild that trust. For instance, $63 million of bonuses that were paid, reversing a decision that your predecessor made to not pay those bonuses is troublesome. I know that you didn't begin this rulemaking process. There's a rule that's been proposed that some would say puts in rule form what the problem was with the IRS harassing people and trying to cut off their political involvement. Now there's a rule, and the people that were using the tax code to try to quiet people's political involvement are now proposing a rule that some would argue does the same thing and infringes upon their First Amendment right. And you didn't start the process, but you are continuing the process. And one of the things that I've read from time to time, I know you were in my community, you've kind of on a whirlwind tour to talk to all the different IRS offices. One of your constant messages seems to be that we don't have enough money to do the things we need to do. And one of the things that I read about from time to time is the fact that you can't answer all the phone calls, that I think it's 61% of the phone calls are probably going to be answered. I've heard you say that if we had more money, we could hire more people, we could answer more phone calls. And I know in Jacksonville, my hometown, when you were there was an article in the paper and said that you had said we don't have enough money and to answer more than 61% of the calls. And you found that, I think, unacceptable or intolerable or outrageous or something. But I must tell you that what I find unacceptable is that in this $11.3 billion appropriation that the IRS received this year, that you can't find the money to answer more than half the phone calls, and yet you can find the money to pay $63 million in bonuses. And it seems to me that that might be a slap in the face of the taxpayers, because their consumer services, as they try to find out more from the IRS, they're going to find that that's going down, and yet the salary and bonuses of the employees are going up. And I would think that's hard to tolerate as a taxpayer or as an individual saying, I'd like better consumer services. It bothers me to see that you don't have enough money to answer those phone calls, but you've got the money and the time and the energy to pursue this rule. I read today, I think there are nearly 100,000 comments on this rule. And the XL pipeline, which is pretty controversial, there may be 7,000 comments. So here's a rule that is wildly controversial and has to be taking some time and energy and money. But you continue to pursue that, or whoever started continues to pursue it, and yet there's not enough money to answer the phone. And then I know that we hear from time to time the argument, well, if you just give the IRS more money, then they will collect more revenue. In fact, the argument is that if you give the IRS $1, then you'll get back $4 or $5 in maybe $6 in revenue. And if you don't give the IRS money, then the revenues will go down and the deficit will go up. Well, it makes intuitive sense to say if you give the IRS more money, they can collect more revenue. It sounds like it makes sense, but there's no empirical evidence that that's true. In fact, at times, just the opposite is true. In 2001, 2009, the appropriations was increased for the IRS and the revenue collections went down. So obviously there are other factors than just how much money the IRS got. You got to look at inflation, you got to look at population, you got to look at tax policy, you got to look at a lot of different factors. In fact, last year, 2013, that's the best year ever. We collected $2.8 trillion, the most money the United States of America has ever collected, and that's at a time when the sequester was going on And so there's less money for the IRS to have. So all of that to say is I don't necessarily believe that a higher level of spending equals a higher level of service. And that's why I think we have an oversight hearing to say, how are you spending the money? Because it's not just how much you have, but how you spend it. And I think how you spend it can actually improve even if you don't have as much as you might like to have. Because everybody knows government needs money to provide services, right? But everybody also knows that these are difficult times in our country. We've got $17 trillion in debt. And we have an annual deficit. This year, it's going to be less than $1 trillion, and we're all excited about that. It's the first time in 5 years it's been less than $1 trillion, and it's still probably the fourth or fifth largest deficit we've ever had on an annual basis. So yes, government needs money, but I would say today government needs something more than that. It needs discipline to rein in spending, needs courage to make tough decisions, needs a commitment to make sure that we do everything more efficiently and more effectively than we've done it before. And we want to work with you to help you do that, to help you set the right priorities, to help you spend the money that we appropriate to you. And so we thank you for being here today. We'll have questions, I know. And before we do that, I want to turn to my friend, the ranking member, Mr. Sharon. And first, let me say to him, because it's been a whirlwind time when we finished the omnibus bill, but he's been a great partner. We don't always agree on everything, but as we went through the final negotiations with our Senate counterparts to come to this conclusion, it was a team effort, and I want to thank him for that and ask him for any comments he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for your willingness to work with us, and especially your staff and our staffs that did a great job under a lot of pressure. And let's hope that that last omnibus puts us back on the road to special order, something that Chairman Rogers and I love and you love, something that some of the younger, newer members on the committee and Congress may not have never witnessed. You know, the days when we could pass a bill with 400 votes and actually predict whether it would be 350 or 400. Those days are long gone, but they may come back based on what we saw. I'd also like to welcome the new Internal Revenue Service Commissioner, John Koskinen, for his first hearing before the subcommittee. I thank you for your service to our nation and for undertaking this endeavor at a very challenging time for the IRS. By now, most Americans know that last year it was reported that the IRS had used inappropriate criteria to decide what 501c4 entities should be subject to greater scrutiny. As I said at the time, all members of Congress were appalled by these actions, which affected liberal and conservative groups alike. We all believe that the IRS must enforce our tax laws in a fair, even-handed manner, and that did not occur here. At a hearing soon after the controversy came to light, the question I asked was, where do we go from here? What must be done to prevent something like this from happening again? I think that the IRS has made a good start at answering those questions. The IRS has implemented all of the recommendations suggested by the Taxpayer Inspector General for Tax Administration in this area. The IRS has also implemented numerous internal reforms that have brought more accountability and oversight to the review decisions that are being made. And perhaps most importantly, the IRS is making an effort to further clarify for 501s what is and what is not political activity. There is no doubt that in recent years, a number of groups have abused their claims to the 501 tax-exempt status by primarily engaging in political activities. This tax advantage status is not a right, but rather a responsibility, and too many organizations have been claiming it as a way to avoid transparency and taxes. Last year, I suggested that the IRS needed to revisit these rules to provide greater clarity to organizations and to their own auditors as to what is considered a political activity for purposes of making a 501 designation. The rules proposed late last year by the IRS have attempted to do just that, in my opinion. I cannot say whether the IRS has struck the exact balance necessary in these proposed rules, but I do know that they will take any and all concerns seriously before finalizing them. However, this committee cannot help the IRS in these reforms if we do not adequately fund the agency. The fiscal year 2014 Appropriations Act gave the IRS $92 million more than the sequester level, but the IRS is still being funded at its lowest level since fiscal year 2008. If we care about the fair implementation of our tax laws, then this is simply unacceptable. We all know that at this level of funding, every additional dollar given to the IRS allows them to bring in at least $6 from tax cheats. We cannot keep asking more and more of the IRS while providing them with less and less. That is not a good recipe for tax compliance or for this nation. I hope this hearing will be of use to members of this subcommittee as we discuss funding levels for the IRS in the fiscal year. But I am concerned that we might be here to just engage in election year politics. So let me simply state the facts that are on the record already, and these are facts that have already been proven after significant congressional investigation. Yes, the inappropriate targeting affected both liberal and conservative groups alike, not just one side. No, this targeting was not orchestrated by any political appointee or by any individual outside the IRS. And yes, the IRS has been forthcoming in helping numerous investigations by using more than 150 employees to engage in 70,000 hours of work to provide the various investigations with more than 500,000 pages of documents. These are issues that simply do not need to be rehashed at this point again. Rather, this hearing must look forward. The fiscal year 2015 appropriations process is upon us, and the focus of this committee needs to be on ensuring the proper reforms are in place and that the IRS has the resources to complete its mission of serving the American taxpayer and ensuring that everyone follows the law. We all know the importance the IRS has in ensuring that we have the funding to pay for everything from national defense to Head Start. Using this controversy to cut further resources from the agency will not just harm the IRS, but the American people as well. Commissioner, once again, welcome to the subcommittee, and I hope that when we meet again in April, it will be under better circumstances. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Serrano. And now I'd like to turn to the chairman of the full committee who's joined us, Mr. Rogers, for any opening statement he might have.
Thank you, Chairman Crenshaw, for yielding me this time. Thank you, Commissioner Koskinen, for being with the committee for its first hearing of this year. This is the very first of what will be probably 100 to 120 hearings our committee will conduct during the course of this spring season. You're the very first one. So you have the privilege and honor of sitting in the duck tank for the first time, the first one there. Before we get to the important business at hand today, let me first echo the chairman's sentiments regarding the appropriations process in general terms. The omnibus bill for fiscal 14 that we all worked on to pass last month is a true product of compromise. I value my partnership with Ranking Member Lowy, her counterpart on the Senate side, Chairwoman Mikulski, as well as Ranking Member Shelby. Together, along with the subcommittee chairs and ranking members, we made responsible choices to realign our nation's funding priorities and target precious tax dollars where they're needed the most, all the while continuing the four-year trend of reducing federal discretionary spending. While the 14 omnibus is certainly a testament to this committee's long-standing tradition and practice of bipartisanship, workmanship, now is not the time to rest on our laurels. As Chairman Crenshaw has mentioned, I expect the committee to move forward under regular order to draft legislation for federal spending in 2015 that continues to right-size our federal government, that prioritizes spending on programs that are demonstrating results, and that is a product of thoughtful, rigorous oversight. We have much difficult work ahead of us, but I'm hopeful that the process will move swiftly and smoothly given the Ryan Murray budget agreement. I think it's fitting that this commitment to regular order and transparency in the appropriations process is reaffirmed at today's hearing with the IRS. Just as the Congress has a supreme responsibility in stewardship of the taxpayer dollar, so too does the IRS have that special duty to apply our country's tax laws fairly and uniformly. Commissioner Koskinen, you've taken the helm of this agency during a tumultuous time, to say the least, as I feared that in recent years there have been grave violations of the public's trust that should give all Americans cause for concern. And I hope that you're the right person to right the ship. In particular, as I wrote to you earlier this month, I have serious concerns about the proposed regulation published by your predecessor in November. This rule would continue to target the First Amendment rights of the same conservative grassroots organizations that were unfairly scrutinized in applying for tax-exempt status in the run-up to the 2010-2012 elections. Given the agency's recent track record of improper politicization and intimidation, I strongly believe this rule is a step in the wrong direction for an agency struggling to regain the American public's faith and confidence. I look forward to hearing from you about your intentions in this respect today. In particular, your plans to cooperate with the Congress to ensure these dark days in the IRS history books are truly behind us. Acting Commissioner Werfel last came before the committee on the heels of a report detailing the IRS wasteful spending on frivolous conferences and the revelation that the senior executives who oversaw the 501c4 debacle in Cincinnati had received significant performance bonuses. Listening to Chairman Crenshaw's remarks feels like deja vu all over again, as the IRS is charged with the massive undertaking of enforcing the individual mandate of the Affordable Care Act, the greatest intrusion of this agency into personal health care decisions in history, combating identity theft and refund fraud, and addressing international compliance issues, among many other competing priorities. You can understand why the committee views your proposal for additional performance awards and more training conferences with heightened scrutiny. We hope to ascertain how the IRS will go about planning its training conferences to ensure that they are goal-oriented and effective, as well as compliant with the IRS's procurement processes. I also hope you can explain, to the satisfaction of this committee, how and why $63 million in performance bonuses are appropriate or beneficial to the taxpayer. As we're all painfully aware, we're in the middle of some grim budget times, and every federal agency, especially the IRS, is duty-bound to root out excess and waste. When we provide you with more than $11 billion annually to fulfill these duties, we expect you to spend it wisely and effectively. Mr. Commissioner, I hope that we have your commitment to work with this committee to achieve our shared mission of protecting the taxpayers and their hard-earned dollars. We look forward to hearing your testimony. We wish you the best of luck.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers, and now we'll turn to the Commissioner for his testimony. If I could ask you to, if you have any written remarks you'd like to submit, but if you could keep your oral testimony in the neighborhood of 5 minutes, it'll give us more time to ask questions. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman.
Turn on your mic.
All right, as they say in the French, da capo a fino. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Serrano, Chairman Rogers, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to give you an overview of IRS operations. I'm honored to serve as the IRS Commissioner and to have the opportunity to lead this agency and the dedicated employees because I believe that the success of the IRS is vital to this country. I want to outline for you what I believe are the IRS's key challenges and what I will focus on moving forward. First and foremost, we just started a new filing season 4 weeks ago, and over 39 million returns have already been filed. We sometimes lose sight of what a tremendous accomplishment it is for the agency to process efficiently 150 million individual taxpayer returns, with 120 million of those being filed electronically. I'm confident that, thanks to the hard work of our employees, the filing season will continue to go well. Another priority for our agency is to put to rest all of the issues and concerns surrounding applications for tax-exempt status. The management problems associated with the 501c4 application process have, as noted, shaken public trust in the IRS. Under the leadership of former Commissioner Danny Werfel, Acting Commissioner Danny Werfel, the IRS has already made great progress in this area, and it's my job to help make sure we complete that work. In every area of the IRS, taxpayers need to be confident they will be treated fairly, no matter what their background or their affiliations. Public trust is the IRS's most valuable asset. The IRS also needs to build on the progress that's been made to improve tax compliance in a number of areas. One of the most critical is refund fraud caused by identity theft. The IRS has gotten much better at resolving identity theft cases. We closed 963,000 cases last year of individuals who had had their identity stolen, which is almost double the number for 2012. And we're resolving those cases for taxpayers much faster. On average, it now takes about 120 to 135 days for new cases, compared to more than 300 days in prior years. But we can and will do better. Along with enforcement, the IRS also needs to keep looking for ways to improve the service we provide to taxpayers, which is critical to ensuring that our system of voluntary compliance works properly. I am deeply concerned, as the Chairman noted, about the significant reduction in the IRS budget over the last years. Our current funding level, at just under $11.3 billion, is roughly $900 million below what it was 4 years ago. We now have about 10,000 fewer employees than 4 years ago, including 3,500 fewer revenue agents and officers. As a result of fewer staff and reduced enforcement activities, the IRS estimates it will not be able to collect billions of dollars in enforcement revenues. In fiscal year 2014, we expect audits conducted by the IRS will decline by an estimated 100,000, and the number of collection activities will decline by an estimated 190,000. One of our biggest concerns is being able to deliver the services taxpayers need during the filing season. Last year, as noted, for example, almost 40% of taxpayers who called were unable to reach an IRS employee. And as the Chairman noted, that's unacceptable. Our employees are doing their best to answer every call they can, and our level of service goal during the filing season is 70%. For the full year, however, we estimate 18 million taxpayer calls will not be able to reach us. Another area of concern is the amount of time people are having to wait to get in-person help at our taxpayer assistance centers. We've had reports from field staff of taxpayers lining up outside those centers well before they open in the morning to make sure they receive service the same day. The best of employee efforts and expansion of our online offerings can only go so far to ameliorate those problems. Amid our budget difficulties, I do recognize that there has been a loss of confidence within Congress and this committee in regard to the way the IRS has managed its operations. One of my responsibilities is to ensure that we quickly solve management and operational problems that may arise so that Congress and this subcommittee can be confident our funding will always be used wisely, that we understand the need to be careful stewards of taxpayer dollars entrusted to us. I look forward to working with Congress and this subcommittee to solve our budget problems. I hope that one of my legacies at the end of my 4 years as IRS Commissioner will be that we've put the agency on a more solid and sustainable funding level. This concludes my statement, and I would be happy to take your questions.
Well, thank you very much. Let me start the question process. You know, in my opening statement, I mentioned the issue about responding to the questions that people have. You just mentioned that 40% of the calls, I think, went unanswered. And it all, as we have this oversight hearing and we talk about how you spend the money, I want to pursue how you make the decisions in terms of priority. In other words, where do you decide to spend money and where do you decide you're not able to spend money when you have limited resources? By the way, this subcommittee oversees about 30 different agencies. and your agency receives the largest amount of money. In fact, it receives more than half of all the money that we're allocated to distribute to these agencies. And so we have to make decisions in terms of priority, who's spending their money wisely, who's not. You obviously have a lot of leeway to make those decisions with the IRS. And it seems to me that one of the most important things you do is deal with consumer services. You're like the front door. The phone call is the entryway to the IRS, and that's a lot of people's first contact with the IRS when they make a phone call. And if they find that half their phone calls aren't going to be answered, and if they do get answered, they're going to have to spend up to 20 minutes waiting, then that's not a very good perception of the general public to have about the IRS and its operations of business. Now, I want you to tell this committee how you make that decision, because here's what bothers me. There's an old trick in this town where anytime you need more money, you pick out the most visible service that you offer and one that maybe inflicts the most pain on people, and then you say, we can't do that unless we have more money. It's like you turn out the lights in the Washington Monument because we don't have enough money. When the sequester came, people said, well, we can't have tours of the White House because we don't have enough money. We won't let the veterans go visit the World War II Memorial because we don't have enough money. And I'm not suggesting that you're using that old trick, but sometimes I have to wonder, when you have $11 billion and you have to make these decisions, it seems to me that one of the priorities ought to be to interact with people. So tell the subcommittee how you go about making that decision, because I looked back 2004, I looked back 10 years. In 2004, 87% of the phone calls got answered, and that was a time when the IRS had $1 billion less than it has today. Now, I know you've got more responsibility and all those kind of things, but my point about how you spend the money is just as important sometimes as how much you have to spend. So tell us, if you will, do you ever think about, well, we've got rent, we've got technology, we've got certain other things, and obviously in this case, you had $63 million to pay the bonuses, and you're pursuing a rule that arguably clarifies things, but some people would say it goes in the wrong direction. So what goes through that decision-making process to decide where the money gets spent?
It's a good question. We spend a lot of time worrying about that question, especially trying, as I say, to make sure we spend the money most effectively. We do some things that we have no choice about. We have no choice about a filing season, which is why we spent a tremendous amount of time and effort making sure it went well this year. Part of the reason it's going well is we haven't had any major tax law changes, so I agree with you that the simpler the tax code is, the better the filing season would go. But that's that's our highest priority. We also do statutory mandates. If you tell us to do something, we will do it. So this year we are spending a significant amount of time implementing the Affordable Care Act and the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. We don't feel we have any choice about that. It's a mandate from Congress that we should perform that. 75% of our budget is personnel. As I said, we have 10,000 fewer people than we had 4 years ago doing significantly more work, including the requirements that we implement those statutes. So we have to make decisions, and the only places we have discretion are, in fact, in tax enforcement and in taxpayer services. We have 3,500 fewer people doing enforcement, revenue agents and revenue officers, 1,500 fewer people answering the phone. So we've made more cuts on the enforcement side than on the call side. But they're two sides of the same coin. Ultimately, we depend upon voluntary compliance, and I am concerned, as you are, that if we can't provide adequate taxpayer service, we're going to undercut the core mission of the agency. As you noted, we receive all of 98% of our money, as the taxpayer advocate has said, comes from compliance. Only 2% of the revenues come from our enforcement efforts, although that's $50 to $60 billion, which is a lot of money. So we need to protect the process as it goes forward. But it's not a question of just a few dollars one way or the other. We did have, and our goal would be to return to those days when we have 85, 80% service on telephone calls, so you don't have to wait more than 5 or 7 minutes, and your call will go through.
But is it a priority? And do you, like, when you look at rent, you look at your contracts, you say, gee, if we could save some money here, save some money there, we'd actually answer more phone calls. Is that pretty high up in your priority list?
We already, by the end of this year, we'll be using 1,300,000 square foot less of office space. We'll save $40 million a year with that. At the end of this year, we will save $60 million by not producing all the publications we used to and not mailing them out to everybody. None of us anymore get the old 1040 forms in the mail. That saves us $60 million. We have cut the use of contractors by $200 million a year. So we already have $300 million a year in annual savings, and we're continuing to look at ways to do better than that. And we'll be happy to share that information as we develop it. But what we're talking about,
I appreciate that, and I just think that it ought to be a big priority, and I hope it is. So let's go now to Mr. Serrano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've been on the job now at the IRS just over 2 months, but you spent 21 years in various public and private sector leadership positions. Because of your previous experiences, I'd be interested in hearing what your first impressions of the IRS are. In particular, I understand that you've been going on a listening tour in the district offices. What have you been hearing from employees? And I'd also like to know what the morale is of the employees after the hits that many have taken for the behavior of a few.
it's an important question. I am on, as I've said, join the IRS, see the United States tour of the 25 major IRS offices. I'm doing that primarily because my experience in the 20 years in the private sector as well as my 20 years in the public sector is the people who know best about what's going on in an organization are the people actually doing the work on the front lines. So I'm listening to employees. I hold a town hall at every place I go with 200 to 300 employees who are able to ask me any question they want. I have lunch with 15 randomly selected employees to listen to what they have to say. And after the couple of months, and I've had briefings obviously with everybody running any department of any significance at the IRS, I've been thoroughly impressed with the professionalism, the skill, the dedication to the mission of all of the employees. What surprised me a little when I went through, I've started in Cincinnati, I've been talked with the chairman in Jacksonville, I've been in 8 cities, I'm off to Fresno tonight. What has surprised me is the level of energy and enthusiasm that remains. These are employees, like all federal employees, that haven't had a pay raise in 4 years, suffered through the government shutdown, suffered with furlough days, and then have endured the criticism over the last 8 to 10 months about the agency. So you would expect that what I would hear would be a lot of grumbling or complaining. What have I heard continually across those 10 cities I've been to already is that the employees' primary concern is there aren't enough people for them in the offices to help taxpayers. The people who I've sat in call centers in Baltimore, call centers in St. Louis, their concern is not that they're overworked, they are working as hard as they can. Their concern is that there aren't as many people as there used to be answering phone calls, and therefore they don't feel they're delivering taxpayers the services they deserve. The people at the taxpayer assistance centers who run those centers, oftentimes with empty desks, are also concerned about the people standing in line. So to me, it's a refreshing indication of the dedication the 90,000 employees working for the IRS have to meeting, as I think the chairman's exactly right, the mission of the agency to provide taxpayers the services they deserve if we expect them to be able to comply with the tax code.
So in general, you feel that the feelings of the staff is one of let's get the job done, notwithstanding the bad publicity caused by some and the shortage in personnel.
That has been my experience, and it has surprised me. I thought I would hear either more grumbling about the fact they hadn't had a pay raise in 4 years or about the fact that they were working overtime because of a lack of personnel. And as I say, I've seen at the last count personally talked to over 3,000 employees in offices with 20,000 employees in them. And the constant theme has been, we need more people to allow us to do the work.
Well, I think it's always a good time, and so I'll take it now to thank our federal workers. I mean, I know there are some small amount of members of both bodies who would like to see no federal government, but that's another issue for another hearing, not this one. I have great respect for for federal workers and the work that they do. Let me ask you a question. Former Acting Commissioner Werfel conducted an internal review that President Obama requested to restore public trust in the IRS. Have the recommendations in that review been carried out? Are there other changes that you think would be helpful? If so, how can this committee assist you?
We have implemented and responded to positively all of the 9 recommendations from the Inspector General focused on the 501c4 situation. We also have done broader reviews of efficiencies in the organization, again, trying to be able to respond more effectively to the demands that have been placed on the organization.
How's my time, Mr. Chairman?
I think it's a yellow sign.
There's a yellow sign, and which means caution,
I take,
and there's 30
Take-
seconds left.
I take umbrage, whatever that means, with that yellow. Just one more question then. The IRS budget was reduced $660 million due to the sequester. What was the effect on your operations based on that reduction?
We expect that if we'd had the pre-sequester number, not the President's request for 2014, the pre-sequester number, we would have been able to answer this year another 3.5 million calls. We would do another 100,000 audits, and we would collect approximately $3 billion more in our enforcement activities.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Serrano. I turn to Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Glad to have you here, sir.
Thank you.
Let me throw out 2 issues, if I may. One is one that I've been dealing with your predecessors, frankly, for quite a long time. And unfortunately, the IRS has not always acted in good faith, actually at one time admitting to me in front of a number of people that they had been instructed to not tell me the truth. In other words, to mislead members of Congress. The issue pertains to a specific
I'm
IRS.
not aware of that situation.
I know.
It'll never be my circumstance. I can
Right,
assure you of that.
right. Well, I'll tell you, I was pleased that they at least admitted to me that they were that the person said I was not authorized to tell you the truth, which I thought was a sad day. But you better believe that that's something that I hope will never happen again. It pertains to an IRS specific ruling. It's a technical advice memorandum, or a TAM, that all of the outside experts say calls into question 70 years of settled law on the definition of political subdivisions, which is, there's many of them around the country, including in Florida. This TAM effectively makes changes, makes a change to the law, and it's retroactive. So obviously, this is not something the IRS should be doing in an audit. If it wants to change the law, it should either come to Congress or at very least proposed regulations to make the changes prospective. It's calling into question millions of dollars of tax-exempt bonds already in the hands of investors, not only by the way of this individual group, this entity that's affected by, but also many, many others around the country, to the point where economic development projects in Florida and other states have been halted as a result of this TAM. And there's those who have gone forward of having to pay higher interest rates because of the vagueness of this TAM. So, Commissioner, I've been trying to deal with this with your predecessors. And we have been misinformed. The chairman is very well of this. I just not need your commitment that you're going to look at this in a serious way to make sure that the IRS is not doing things in a way that, and retroactively in a way that's in essence changing 70 years of state law through a TAM.
I will be pleased to look into that and get back to you.
And I don't expect you to have the details right now. We'll get back to you. And but I do expect to get together with you and let's try to solve that.
That's fine. I'm delighted to talk with you about that further.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The other issue is, let me switch gears. It's the IRS's plans or no plans to move forward with a real-time tax system. This subcommittee has placed report language in our annual appropriations bills, by the way, since 2009, prohibiting the IRS from using any funds on a simple tax return pilot program associated with without seeking specific authorization or appropriations from Congress. That language has been there. February 2013, I sent a letter to Acting Commissioner Miller then, requesting that he confirm in writing that the IRS expenditures to convert to a real-time tax system had ceased. The Commissioner wrote back saying that, quote, the IRS is not in the process of implementing a conversion to a real tax system. Unfortunately, later I learned that there has been money spent on that and that there have been plans underway. I tried to find out how much it was. I asked the IRS how much funding had been spent on a total real tax system. The response was that there was a contract for approximately $3.54 million to explore a system, sir, that Congress has specifically said it can't do and the IRS had told us that they weren't going to do. Later I hear from other committees, the House Government Reform Oversight Committee has recovered additional documents from the IRS that shows that the amount spent by the IRS on the real tax time system could be as much as $30 million. I can't confirm that. So 2 final questions. Are you aware of any further exploration and implementation by the IRS of any data collection system related to the real-time tax system? Number 1. And again, because that language in the appropriations bill since 2009 seems to have been absolutely systematically ignored. And will you pledge to adhere to the report language in the current FY14 omnibus? And again, what I'm asking is also 100% transparency to this subcommittee, to members of the subcommittee, on the other issue, but also on the real tax system.
Yes, no, I'm happy to commit that we will follow, and we will follow all of the instructions, whether you give them to us personally or in legislation, because I think that's important for us to be able to do.
Thank you, Commissioner.
With regard to the real-time tax system,
Sure.
part of the problem is all sorts of different systems have been called real-time tax. The thing that has been the focus of a lot of external studies is the idea of could we pre-populate a return form, get information in pre-populated so you could look at it and then you could make decisions, or the IRS could even file your return for you. And that's what a lot of people have talked about as being the real-time tax system.
Correct.
We're not doing anything with that. It would take a long time to be able to do that. We do have work going on to try to figure out how to get better third-party information into our system earlier, so as we actually match up tax returns for identity theft or are engaged in audits, we'll have more data available in a more timely manner. Right now, we don't get the Social Security, the W-2 forms from Social Security or the 1099 forms until late in the spring, which doesn't do us much good as everybody's filing in January, February. So some people internally have called that a real-time tax system, but it has nothing to do with the program that you're talking about, and we have no program going forward that I know of, and certainly we don't intend to do anything like that without talking to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to working with the Commissioner on these 2 areas, also on identity theft and other issues.
Good.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Quigley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Commissioner. In addition to everything else you have going with the IRS, this is a historic filing period. The Defense of Marriage Act was struck down last June by the Supreme Court, and so for the first time, same-sex couples will be filing federal tax returns together. This is the first filing period that is taking place. What education within the IRS and outside the IRS is taking place? How are you helping to educate the public and making resources available to people, particularly with some of the complexities involved? As you know, different states have different laws, and I have residents in my district and in my state who were married in Iowa, for example. Illinois is just now beginning to recognize same-sex marriages. So what is the IRS doing to deal with these complexities?
Well, I think it's important. One of the things that did surprise me, back to Congressman Serrano's question, is the amount of outreach the IRS does as a general matter to taxpayers. We have a website which, if you look at it today, is a very different website than it was a year ago in the sense of trying to be more user-friendly, provide information taxpayers need directly. We have wonderful partnerships with tax preparers who actually advise. We give them information. We share information about what information their clients will need. We have a YouTube channel with over 100 instructional videos about what you should worry about. We just put out our first advice to taxpayers this week about starting to look forward to how to deal with the Affordable Care Act, particularly advising taxpayers if their circumstances change during the year, they need to adjust whatever premium tax credit they're getting. So in the Defense of Marriage Act, we have been putting out reminders to people. We remind people when it's time to pay your estimated taxes. So there's a tremendous amount of time spent reaching out to taxpayers, trying to educate them as much as we can about the tax code. As I somewhat facetiously said, it may take a while before I can convince people that we're from the IRS and we're here to help you, but we do spend a significant amount of time doing just what you're talking about, which is prior to the filing season and during the filing season to give people as much information as they can get. So this year, for instance, we are advising people that don't call if you need to find out about where your refund is. Go to the website, push the tab, and last year 250 million people got information about, quote, where's my refund? This year, for the first time, you can go to the website, authenticate who you are, and you can get transcripts of your previous filings, and you can print them out at home. You don't have to come to an assistance center. You don't have to call. So it goes partially to the chairman's concern, which I have, which is we can't just sit around and say, gee, what will we do? We've spent a lot of time trying to say, what information do taxpayers need? What do they call about? How much of that could we give them in some other channel of communication? So we have tweets. I mean, we do things that I don't know how to do.
So you recognize these are unique circumstances.
Those are
The
unique
First time in history this is taking
Yes.
place, and a lot of taxpayers need additional assistance.
Assistance.
All the resources you're talking about are helping these new filings.
Right, and the people who are on the phones have information about that, so if taxpayers call and get through, they will be able to get that kind of information. But it's on the website. We've, as I say, tried proactively in all of these areas to get information out to taxpayers before they fill out their returns and even before they feel they have to call.
We appreciate that. Your predecessor talked about the cases of identity theft, said that there were nearly 250,000 reported to your agency in 2011 and 816,000 in 2012. Obviously, this is an alarming increase. What are you attributing this to, and what is the agency doing?
It's been an explosion since 2010 through actually last filing season in terms of people either borrowing, stealing, going to the death master files, getting Social Security numbers, and filing false returns and trying to get refunds early. We have spent time, as I was talking to the chairman earlier, spent time in Jacksonville with a wonderful task force that jointly between the IRS criminal investigation and state and local law enforcement in Jacksonville and Florida have become much more aggressive at pursuing this. We've had, last year had 1,500 investigations, up from 300 the 2 years before. We have a substantially increased sophisticated filter system that identifies suspicious returns as they're filed electronically. Last year, we actually saw a plateauing in the number of returns that came through that we were able to tax. So we think that between, we had 1,000 indictments recommended last year, up from 165 2 years earlier. We think we are getting some of the people off the street. We're, I think, getting the message out that this is not a free game. It's not a free good, that you can't simply buy or steal a Social Security number and get a refund without being prosecuted for that. But it is a significant problem. We had in the budget proposed $100 million of IT work that was not included in the budget, but we're figuring in some other ways. And part of the $92 million additional funding provided was for just this purpose, and we're spending it that way. But it's going to be a problem we think we have under control. As I noted, we're able to resolve for taxpayers the identity theft problems much faster than we used to. But it's one of the 3 or 4 highest priorities we have in tax administration.
Thank you. Mr. Graves.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Commissioner,
Thank you.
a lot of discussion about the 501c4s earlier. What are some specific examples of 501c4s?
501c4s cover a wide gamut. You know, they're everything from garden clubs to, in fact, advocacy groups. And in fact, the vast majority of 501c4 applications have nothing to do with political activity as they go forward. A relatively small percent are in that area. So one of the issues that, as we can talk about the proposed draft regulations, is that everybody is focused on, well, it's really just political organizations that are involved. But as I say, probably 90% of the 501c4s have nothing to do with political advocacy.
What's a specific example of a 501c4, an organization that might come under scrutiny under this rule?
Well, under this rule, there would be any organization that is a social welfare organization providing information to the public that engages in political activity in a political campaign. So if you are an organization and you're providing information about any particular subject matter, that would be viewed as social welfare. If you then start running ads for a candidate in a campaign supporting that, that would be political activity or campaign activity.
So is it not true, though, under the proposed definition that it's any public communication that's made within a certain time period before an election would be considered candidate-related political activity if it identifies that candidate or a political office?
Right. Well, your question was, what about a C4 and what have historically been there? There is a draft regulation out. As the chairman knows, we're actually expect to have over 100,000 comments on it. Right. And it's asking for just this discussion. That's what I assume the 100,000 comments are doing. Right. And that has 3 issues. One is, what should be the definition of political activity? What should be included as not appropriate for a for a social welfare organization, and what would be in that pool? Then the next question
that
is
not
how
part
much
the
of that,
proposed definition?
pardon?
Is there not a proposed
There,
definition?
no, there's a proposed definition,
so
and
let's
comment
get
is
to the
being
proposed-
asked for that.
Right, right. So,
And so my position on it
but
is
is
I'm,
that the proposed definition right now, the one I just read, that deals with political activity as it relates to a candidate or a political office
right.
in a time
The-
period
it-
before
It has been out there, and that's
election?
proposed, and
So
the
that's the
comment,
proposed-
the comment that
so-
people are asking is, what are the options to that? Should it be applied at all? Should we stay with the facts and circumstance test we've had?
Let's assume that that proposed definition stays in place as been proposed by
I would
your-
like to
your
not assume
agency.
that, because I think that what we need to do is review the 100,000 comments, which I am going to be involved with, because it's a joint regulation from Treasury and IRS. And as I've said in my prepared testimony, my goal is that whatever comes out of this, if there is a regulation, it's not guaranteed there will be one that's clear, fair to everyone, and easy to administer. The
you don't
IRS is not a
anticipate-
political organization, and we ought to do whatever we can to get out of the politics of all this.
Right, so I just heard you say then that although it's a proposed definition right now, you hope that that is not the final definition.
Well, I hope you wouldn't put those words in my mouth. What I said was, I hope that whatever regulation comes out, if there is one that's clear, fair, and easy to administer.
I thought I
That
heard
does
you
not take a
say that you
position
hope
on
that
what
is
is
not the
out there as
final-
draft.
I thought I heard you say you hope that is not the final definition. But under that current definition, if it were final, it would mean no faith-based organization can issue a voter guide on public positions that have been taken by candidates to consolidate that information to assist voters. Is that not accurate?
If that's, candidates are mentioned, and that's within, as I
It would
understand,
mean
30 to
that-
60 days, depending whether it's a primary or an election, that's what the
It
proposed
would mean
definition
that
would
Planned
be.
Parenthood wouldn't be able to issue.
Pardon?
It would mean organizations such as Planned Parenthood would not be able to issue voter guides as well. Or the National Abortion
Within
Rights
the ambit of a
League could not
campaign,
issue
within a
as
campaign,
well.
that's what the draft would be, and that's what the comments are about. And there will be, ultimately, after the comments are reviewed, there will be a public hearing at which congressional members as well as the public will be invited to attend.
Under the current definition, does that mean that the, I guess, let's say the American Legion or the VFW, would they be able to make phone calls to notify voters that, one, to register to vote, maybe a potential voter, or to notify voters about candidates and their positions on military defense positions or expansion or defense in general?
Again, the proposed draft up for comment, of which we have 100,000, and we're looking forward to reviewing them, would say that voter registration drives within the context of a campaign would not be allowable. And the other question that needs to be answered, I would hope everybody would understand, A, it's a question of what's the definition going to be, should it be? B, how much of that activity, again, it's not proposed that people have no activity. The question is how much of that activity, as it's defined, can an organization engage in before it jeopardizes its tax exemption? And the third important question is, to what 501c organizations should the regulation, if there is one, apply?
Okay, one last question, Mr. Chairman. How many in the department have been reprimanded or terminated as a result of that latest scandal of scrutiny of various organizations?
That process is still, there's a review board. The leadership from the top on down is all gone at this point, and several of the people are no longer at the IRS.
Is there a number you can place on that?
There's not a number. I'm actually not at liberty to talk about personnel actions. All I can tell you is Danny Werfel appointed a special review board. It reviewed it. The leadership, starting at the grounds level all the way up through the exempt organization leadership structure, has all been changed.
And you feel like it's been, I guess substantially, it's been justified, all the actions have been, all the reprimands have been taken care of, and you're satisfied with the direction the organization is going now and with the way it's handled?
I am satisfied that, as I say, the IG had very good recommendations for training, for guidance, for better review of how organizations, if there are questions, are handled. All of that's gone on. I went to Cincinnati and talked to people to make sure that people are comfortable that, in fact, whatever the issues were before have been solved. So, again, I think, as I said, it's important going forward. No, not waiting. We have 6 investigations going on, and as I've said, I'm looking forward to having at least 1 or 2 of them finished sometime soon, so we can see what the actual determination of the facts are, and we'll respond appropriately and accordingly, and we'll let you know how the response is to that. But I think people need to understand that going forward from, as they say, this point forward, anyone dealing with the IRS, any taxpayer, should be comfortable that they're going to get treated fairly in the same way anybody else is, no matter what their political affiliation, whatever their organization is, whoever they voted for in any election recently. whether they go to church or don't go to church. If they deal with the IRS, they're going to be treated in the same way everybody else is. If you get audited, we still, even with limited resources, we'll do 1,400,000 audits this year, a lot of them just by correspondence. But if you get a letter, if you get correspondence, you need to be confident and comfortable that that's because there's something in your return that if it was in somebody else's return would get the same response. That it has nothing to do with who you actually talked to 2 weeks ago, what meeting you went to, what organization you belong to.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Thank you.
Thank you. Turn to Mr. Amadeo, and in your absence, we welcomed you, so we welcome you again in your presence.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope my presence will be better than my absence, but the jury's out on that, so we'll go from there. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I want to follow up where Mr. Graves was going. And first of all, I've looked at your statement, and so I assume you've looked at it, and this is your statement. I'm assuming you had help preparing it, but this is your statement that you stand by for purposes of the hearing today.
I wouldn't have submitted it if I weren't going to stand by it.
Very good. You've indicated at the bottom of page 1 that the IRS needs to continue to fulfill responsibilities to implement tax-related provisions, major legislation. You've referenced the ACA and the FATCA. I would like to focus for a minute on the genesis of the regulation rewrite. In that, do you know when 501c4 was first put on the books as legislation generally? And let me tell you why I'm asking you to help you out. Because we're talking about redoing a regulation now as a result of what happened, I don't believe in Cincinnati, but all the way up the line. And so I'm wanting to know how 501c4 worked before this latest round of stuff that started with Cincinnati.
Statute's been around for a while. The regulation was drafted in the Eisenhower administration in 1959.
Are you aware of any problems, major problems, where it's been looked at by the IG from Eisenhower forward until what we're talking about now?
I am not.
Okay, thank you, I appreciate that. And so, can you, and I know you weren't there, so I'm going forward. Congratulations on your timing, by the way, it's excellent.
Some people would say that actually the timing isn't so good.
Well, it's better than others. Can you tell me the genesis of how it was decided within the IRS, we need to take a look at 501c4 and do new regulations? And let me tell you why I'm asking that to help you out. Is that I get that you want to restore confidence in the IRS and all its procedures and processes, and good for you. But it's like, there was no, as you indicated in earlier questioning, there was no major tax legislation recently, which has aided in your folks' preparation for stuff. So why is 501c4 now on the top of the regulatory heap?
I do not know. Well, it's on the top of the heap now because there was the IG report noting that there were difficulties in the 501c4 determination process, and one of the strong recommendations by the IG in his report and in his subsequent testimony was that the Treasury Department and the IRS should put on their priority form review and clarification of the requirements. So that was
generated internally as a result of IG operations at Department of Treasury?
No, I'm saying is all I know is that there was the issue in the IG report reported, and that his recommendation, strong recommendation, was that a regulation be considered as part of the priority process at Treasury and IRS, and that's what's happened. What happened before that, I wasn't there and I don't know.
Okay. Are you curious as to anything before?
No, at this point, mostly, I've spent 40 years, 20 in the private sector,
Okay.
20 in the public sector.
And I don't want to cut you off.
Tell you, Mike, can I just give you my answer?
You're not curious. You can't on my 5 minutes. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll answer in my 5
But
minutes.
I endeavor to play by the rules, so,
Okay.
and I know you're not trying to evade anything there. Can you tell me what percentage of the IRS's budget is devoted to 501c4 staffing and operations? And let me tell you why I'm asking that question. Because you talk about resource challenges and priorities. So what percentage of your operations go to 501c4 administration, enforcement, investigation, whatever?
Well, off the top of my head, I would say it's got to be under 1% significantly, in the sense that we have 90,000 employees. Only 800 work in the entire exempt organization
Okay, fair
itself.
enough.
So it's a very small.
So it's 1% of your budget. I appreciate
No,
those
I've said
numbers.
it's got to be, it's 1% or less, but
Okay.
that's an estimate that I'd have to go take a look at. It's clearly, at this point, only 1% of the employees work in the entire exempt organization, and the 501c4s are probably 5% of that. So you're talking about, I don't know,
Okay.
0.2%?
So let me ask you this. I'm going to read off about 4 or 5 things here, and the context is priorities. You got the ACA that you're working on. You've got issues with conferences and spending money. less than 1%, I'll do the math on generally what that is of your budget. You've got bonuses that are in the news. You've got 501c4s, and then you've got taxpayer assistance, which you've devoted a lot of time to. Number one priority for regulatory reform out of those is 501c4?
It's a priority because it's been the issue.
Is it the number one priority reform or not out of those 5 things?
Oh, no,
based
wait,
on-
I'm sorry, you were asking about regulatory reform. We're not reforming ACA, we're just implementing ACA and FATCA. So in terms of regulatory reform, there's a set of regulations that...
No, I understand
If
that.
you're talking about my priorities, I would say that if we can solve the 501c4 problem, put it behind us, that clearly is one of the 5 or 6 priorities I have.
Well, then I guess you see my question where it's less than 1%, and you're talking to this committee about our concerns about taxpayer service, our concerns about getting this filing season right, which are all great, the ACA, which happens to be a small project that's floating around, and you've got some internal management problems that you've inherited. I appreciate all that in terms of conferences and bonuses and stuff like that, and it's like, really? A law that's been around for 50 years, and this is what's going on the top of the regulatory thing. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman, thank you, but I will look forward to interacting in more than a 5-minute context.
I'd be
Thank you for
delighted
your
to sit
appearance.
down and have a longer discussion with you.
Great, look forward to it.
Good.
Thank you. Mr. Yoder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, welcome to the committee. We're pleased to have you come before us today to talk about certainly a variety of issues that are important to constituents at home and many hardworking American taxpayers that interface with the IRS. Last year, in the midst of the outcry over the NSA and the IRS targeting of specifically conservative groups based upon ideology, there was a little-known, I think, breach of public trust that was occurring at the IRS and at other federal agencies that was brought to light, which I think is as stunning or more stunning than some of the other concerns that are constantly raised in the media. And that was the IRS and other federal agencies admitted that they were reading the emails and electronic correspondence of Americans without a warrant, without respect for Fourth Amendment privacy protections. And the IRS went so far to be brazen enough to say that Americans do not have a reasonable expectation of privacy when it comes to their email correspondence. It's stunning. And so under your leadership, I guess my question would be for you, is the IRS continuing to read the emails or other electronic correspondence, the private correspondence of Americans without a warrant in contravention of Fourth Amendment rights? And secondly, when it was reading those emails, are you aware if it was reading both conservative and liberals' private emails equally, or was it also targeting those private readings without warrants just on conservatives as it was targeted by other portions of the IRS?
This is the first time I've heard that the IRS read anybody's email, so I can't give you any further information, but I will definitely look into that, and I will get back to you with answers to your questions.
Oh, I appreciate it, and I'm sure that that if that is occurring, sir, would you, I guess, to the committee, agree to ensure that it no longer occurs at the IRS?
I would be happy to say if we have no authority to do it, then we should not be doing it. Now, criminal investigations does investigate. We had 4,500 recommendations for indictments last year, so there's a whole enforcement arm of the IRS that has law enforcement authority, works with the Justice Department and state and local governments. So I don't know how much of this is in their domain, but let me just...
Well, the IRS, the SEC, and other agencies have argued that they have legal authority under a 1986 law that does not treat electronic correspondence the same way it treats paper correspondence. This is outrageous to a lot of our constituents on both sides of the aisle, and in fact, many interest groups and entities across the country have spoken out about this. I've introduced a bill along with Congressman Graves, my colleague here, and Democratic members that has over 175 bipartisan co-sponsors to ensure that this practice stops at a variety of federal agencies. And so I guess in your leadership, I would hope that you could ensure that you would head that off at the pass, that the IRS would not be engaged in that practice, and that Americans could trust that their private correspondence is not being read by some IRS agent without a warrant, at least, or following the normal due process protections that are outlined in the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
I think it's a very serious matter. I take it seriously. I will look into it, and I will personally get back to you.
Good. I appreciate that, sir. Thank you for your testimony on that. The issue's been raised regarding 501c4 groups. That's certainly been discussed in this committee and many committees, and it's an issue that many Americans are concerned about. I understand that the IRS is attempting to write regulations that might make the enforcement potentially easier on the IRS. I think the biggest concern that many of us have is that most Americans didn't have a lot of trust already, and now they have very little trust that the IRS is being fair in their enforcement of the law. I've had folks say that they don't want to get involved in campaigns or be associated with any groups because they're afraid they're going to be personally subjected to audits. Now, I'm sure you would say today, and I hope that's not happening, but I guess regardless of what rules we write at the IRS, it's not the rules themselves, it's how they're enforced, and it's whether they're enforced fairly and whether we can trust the people, the individuals, in their private moments to do the right thing. And so I guess, sir, what can you do to ensure that the folks like Lois Lerner and others, that even if the rules are there, that they enforce them fairly? That's the biggest concern for my constituents. Not new rules, but that the rules are enforced fairly. And
I agree with you, and that's a situation, as I say, the public needs to have that comfort and confidence. One of the reasons I'm spending as much time talking to frontline employees is I'm trying to make sure that our culture encourages everybody at all levels of the organization to raise issues and problems and concerns whenever they have them. Danny Werfel set in motion the beginnings of a program of a risk management, and I've told people that everybody has to be a risk manager in the agency, and one of the important risks is to make sure that we're following the law, we're treating taxpayers fairly. We have a lot of rules to make sure that happens, a lot of review processes, but it does depend on people, and my concern is to make sure that any employee that is concerned, has a problem, sees anything going on that they feel does not reflect well on the IRS, doesn't treat taxpayers fairly, they need to be comfortable they can raise that directly, either to me or anyone else.
Well, and to that end, sir, we had Commissioner Schulman come before us and confirm long before this became an issue. We asked him in this committee, is this happening? Would you ever allow this happen? And he assured us that it couldn't happen, it wouldn't happen. And so we've heard these assurances before. So just be aware that the trust is not there between Congress and the IRS either, because we've had folks sit in your chair and say, you can trust me, this isn't happening.
And what I would say that, not, again, my point earlier was when I get parachuted into these things, my rule is play the hand you're dealt and not spend a lot of time second-guessing decisions. But as I've told employees, our goal is not to have any mistakes. We've got 90,000 employees in a complicated tax law, so some things are not going to always go perfectly. And I've told them, my view of running an organization is, if there's a problem, it's my problem and we'll work on it together. If there's a mistake, it's my mistake and we'll work on it together. And if there's a problem I don't know about, that's my fault, because that means we have not built a culture where issues, problems, difficulties, mistakes get raised through the system. So my view is, I'm responsible for and accountable for everything the agency does. And whenever we make a mistake, we're going to find it, we're going to fix it quickly, and we'll be transparent about it. And if I don't know about it, as I say, that's my fault, because I'm trying to get the organization comfortable that, as I've told them, every individual needs to feel bad news is good news. I can't help a problem, solve the problem, unless I know it exists.
I appreciate those statements of personal accountability and responsibility, and I look forward to good results from your leadership, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Herrera Butler is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner, for being here. I have a couple questions. Not quite where Mr. Yoder was coming from, but it's on the issue of social media, Twitter and Facebook. Last year, the IRS noted it was in the process of reviewing and updating its policies on the use of social media. Quote, specifically, the IRS is considering what limitations, if any, should be placed on the use of publicly available, so it's a little bit different, social media information in a civil examination or collection action. Any new internal procedures would be made public. I guess I was curious, I have two thoughts about that. How you go about deciding who you're going to read up on, if you're going to go that route. You know, is it someone that you're trying to collect information about for a collection action, or is it that people you're looking at putting together part of your division that's going to specifically troll online spaces? What's your thought process going in this route?
You know, our thought process is, when we do examinations, when we send you a letter about something in your return, we deal with you about the return. We do not go and look for whatever your Facebook account might look like. That doesn't seem to me efficient, effective, or appropriate. When we are in criminal investigations, as I say, the Criminal Investigation Department will use all of the information available when they're tracking down people, trying to track down assets. And so there, I think it's appropriate for them to use whatever information they have that they need to. But that's when we're tracking down people who are, in fact, have violated the law, have not paid the taxes that they owe, and are. One revenue agent made a good point to me in Philadelphia. He said, we have to distinguish between the willing to pay who have difficulties and the unwilling to pay. And the willing to pay who have difficulties haven't paid, but that's because they've got some problem in their family. We ought to deal with them as we try to with installment agreements or offers in compromise. They're very different than the people who are unwilling to pay, hiding assets, moving them around, storing them offshore. My view is, well, we should chase them to the end of the earth, and if we can use social media to find the assets or find them, we ought to do that.
So you're saying you exclusively use Facebook and Twitter for unwilling to pay criminal investigations?
That's where I think it is appropriate and important. I don't know.
So you're not using Facebook and Twitter for people who are not in criminal investigations?
I do not know about that. I will find out the answer to that.
I would love the answer to that
It's an important question,
Yeah.
and I will be delighted to find out and share with you that answer.
Please share it with the committee. We
I
would all like to
be
know that
delighted to
information.
share it with the chairman and everyone.
Kind of switching gears, I got a letter from a constituent who lives abroad and obviously has some serious concerns about the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. And his observation was that a large number of Americans who are voluntarily compliant with this, with our tax code, and this law is really detrimentally impacting those folks. Obviously, you're wanting to go after people who are not. But what he was saying and what he's seeing is that his bank account's already been closed. He has other accounts that, and specifically, his bank cited this law is the reason. So he's losing different services, and he's concerned about other accounts he has. And here he's trying to be compliant. He is being compliant, and he said basically his comment to me was, I'm being punished for having an American citizenship. I'm following the spirit of the law, not just the letter. And here I'm losing services in other in the countries that I'm living that have these accounts because they're citing this law. What are you doing about? So you talked a little bit before about going after criminal investigations. What are you doing to make this easier on law-abiding citizens who are trying to comply, who are getting these, we don't want them to have to disavow their American citizenship.
I think that's exactly right. And one of the things we're looking at as we start to get the information is how to make sure that we impose as little burden as we can on the people you're talking about who have been compliant for some time. The problem he's running into isn't from the IRS or from the United States. The problem he's running into is some banks in some countries are saying, rather than actually determining who's a native and who's a foreign-born participant, we're simply going to only deal with resident citizens. And they're saying, if you're not a resident citizen, we're not going to provide you services. That's not a widespread activity because banks obviously are anxious in this global economy to deal with citizens wherever they're coming from. And we're not the only country engaged in this effort. But it is unfortunate wherever a bank in a country X decides that they're only going to deal with their own citizens, you'd think it would be penny wise and pound foolish because they're missing out on people like your constituent correspondent. But anyway, whatever we can do for people who've already been compliant to try to make sure that we don't impose unnecessary burdens on them and that we ameliorate it to the extent we can, we will. But obviously, we don't control what foreign banks do.
And really quickly, if someone has a challenge, whether it's this person overseas or whether it's the small businessman I sat next to on my flight over here who did tell me he feels like he's received retribution for for speaking out politically in the form of a beautiful audit. If someone has that concern or they feel like they've been unfairly targeted, who do they redress their grievances to? Is there a third independent group, or do they have to come back to you all and say, hey, wait a minute, you're doing this unfairly?
No, they could obviously feel free to contact me personally, but the Taxpayer Advocates has been set up independently by statute. You'll hear from her a little later. Okay. They can contact her. The Inspector General does a very good job of pursuing specific issues and complaints. My view is that those are important sources of information. I chaired the Interagency Council of Inspectors Generals for 3 years while I was OMB, and I think Inspectors General provide a valuable service and a lot of information. As I told the chairman earlier, IGs don't create the problem. They actually just discover it for you before it gets bigger and more complicated, and the same with GAO. So I would think that anytime they feel that way, they should feel comfortable contacting the taxpayer advocate, because I do think, going back to this issue, I could take just 30 seconds, is we're going to do 1,400,000 audits. Some of those people are going to be Republicans, some are going to be Democrats, some are going to be people who never go to church, some are going to be people who go to church regularly. And what's important, and all we can do is continue to emphasize it and actually perform, is for those people to understand they're not getting that letter from the IRS because of, as I say, who they voted for, where they were last week at a symposium or a meeting. They're getting that letter because there's something in their return that we're asking information about.
Well, let me, to that point, we're going to have to just say, and I'll cut it off here, you're going to have to prove it to us, because they have received that letter because of political ideology before. It has happened. That's part of what this whole controversy was. So we look forward to you proving it to us as we move forward.
We will do
With that, I yield back.
It's intolerable for anybody to have it actually happen, and I think it's extremely corrosive to the tax system for people to think it might happen. And they have to understand that we take this, going back to the priorities, my highest priority is to do whatever I can to restore whatever trust has been lost by the American public and the IRS. We should be viewed as, we want people to pay the right amount, not more, not less. And that if you deal with us, we're going to deal with you fairly in the same way we would deal with anyone else.
Thank you very much. We've got some time for another round of questions if members have. And let me start that by asking two questions. One has to do with the 501c4. There's been a lot of discussion about that. And my main concern, as I said in my opening statement, is that it seemed to be premature in the sense that all these investigations were going on and we didn't have all the information. And I think this subcommittee will recall we put a provision in our markup that said that we wouldn't spend any money that was appropriated under this bill to work on that rule. And that was adopted by the full committee, the full House, and it didn't make it into the omnibus bill. But there was concern that when we have limited resources, that maybe that's something we could wait till we had all the information. But that didn't happen, and it's going along. And I assume that you don't plan on stopping that anytime soon. So let me just ask you, when you anticipate finalizing the draft regulation? For instance, are you going to finalize the draft before the November elections?
I think the chances of it getting finalized before the November election are fairly slim. We have an overwhelming amount of comments to take into consideration. There will be a public hearing. There will be more opportunities for people to provide information to us. If there's going to be a regulation, and I would say if, nothing guarantees when you start the process you end up with a product at the end. If there is going to be a regulation and it has changes in it, it would very likely be republished for more comments. So as I say, I think my hope would be that at least some of the 6 investigations would be done well before we get to anything that looks like finality in whatever regulation might come out. But because I think it's right, we need to know what the facts were in that particular circumstance, although again, the general issue is how do we provide clarity not just for the IRS. My concern is if I were organizing an advocacy operation, I would be appreciative if I had clear guidelines as to how to organize it, but most importantly, if I had clear guidelines as to how to operate it. 2 or 3 years down the road, the more clarity we can provide to those people as to what you can do and what you can't do and how much of it you can do without being in jeopardy, it seems to me is very important. The facts and circumstances test and the unclarity about how much of political activity can you do means that everybody is sitting out there worrying and wondering, well, how does it get measured? Is this going to count on one side of the equation or on the other side of the equation? Am I above if I'm 45%? Is that now no longer primarily? And I just don't think it's helpful for us, but it certainly isn't helpful for people running those organizations.
Well, it's good to hear that you don't think it'll be finalized before the elections. I guess they could be, if there's some speeded up process. But maybe an equally important question is: do you think these draft regulations have they already produced a chilling effect as people decide, gee, maybe we better avoid political activities because we don't want to jeopardize our tax-exempt status or have it denied or have it revoked? Might that happen?
I don't know. I haven't seen any studies or surveys about that. We have tried to emphasize that We have revised and taken all the IG recommendations into consideration. We're providing, we think, appropriate training and oversight for the process, and so we're encouraging people to continue to file, if they have an interest in doing that, applications, and that they will, in fact, we have a streamlined process that was set up to solve the backlog, which says if you'll simply say that you're not going to spend more than 40% of your time on what has been historically viewed as political activity, you can get a streamlined approval even, so that you won't even have to worry about the backlog.
So, and last question is you I think answer this a little bit, but whether there'll be, you'll wrap up all these loose ends and be one final regulation, or maybe it might be a series of regulations that are, adopted over the next couple of years. You have any judgment about that?
I have no idea. As I said, from my standpoint, I'm trying to keep an open mind about the whole thing, see what the comments are. There is a complicated question of what should the definition, whatever it be, apply to. Should it apply to 501c3s, 501c5s, 6s, 7s? And I think those are important questions that you can't know an easy answer to. Again, my instinct is the clearer it is, and the more simpler and administratable it is, and the fairer to everyone it is, the better off we'll all be.
Well, let me ask you one quick happy question, and that is that I found out for the first time this last week that there's a program called Free File that the IRS has in conjunction with a lot of folks that prepare tax services. And we had an event in my home district to try to make more people aware of it, because I'm not sure everybody is aware. But if you make less than $58,000 a year, you qualify for the Free File, and you can actually file your tax return for free because of some arrangement that the IRS has with this alliance of folks. And so they told me that they have to renew that every 5 years with a memorandum of understanding. And so in an effort to make more and more people aware, they said 70% of the taxpayers might be aware or might be eligible for this Free File. So tell us very quickly if you think that's a good idea, and if you plan on signing a new memorandum of agreement to extend it for another 5 years.
It is a good idea. I should take you on the hustings with me, because every time I do a filing season discussion with the press, I try to emphasize that we have this agreement with 14 providers, all the major ones you would think of. You can go on the Free File website. 100 million Americans are eligible. You can pick whichever of the 14 you like, and you can actually file for free. You don't have to pay anything. You get the same treatment you would be if you were actually in one of their offices. And it's a wonderful partnership, and we do plan to renew it and try to give more visibility to it, because I think taxpayers comfortable doing it without, doing their returns without a provider should take advantage of this. And it's one of the services we're happy to provide.
Well, you are from the IRS, and you are here to help us. So thank you for that. Mr. Serrano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope you give me a little leeway, because I may shock the committee and the Congress using a little more time to say that I totally agree with Mr. Yoder. And I know that's shocking to some folks. I sponsored his bill, co-sponsored his bill. As ranking member, I participated in a voice vote on his amendment last year, because whether Democrat or Republican, I don't believe that our privacy should be lost. And so when you hear about government perhaps reading emails, that's unacceptable. It's unacceptable to us, and it's unacceptable to our democracy. And I'm beginning to hear some people say, well, if you have nothing to hide. It has nothing to do with having anything to hide. It has to do with the Constitution and what this country is known for, and the fact that so many other people throughout the world would like to imitate who we are, or who they think we are. And I know who we are, and we shouldn't have that. Now, that doesn't mean I sign up with those who don't believe in a federal government, or those who would like to disable government agencies to the point where they can't function. But on this, we agree that Americans have a right to privacy, and that should be something that we protect. So I think the big headlines tomorrow in one of the Hill papers will be Serrano and Yoder agree on something, and that's a good sign.
I'm happy to be the catalyst for that.
Yes. Well, as soon as you tell me where the hustings are, I have no idea if they're near the Bronx or anywhere like that. So let me get this straight. If you have 501c4 status, You're not supposed to engage primarily in activities that are political. If your activities are primarily political, then my understanding is that you can register as a tax-exempt organization under another part of the tax code, Section 527. The problem for some organizations is that if they do this, they'll have to disclose who their donors are, as opposed to being registered under 501c4, where you don't have to disclose who funds you. So even though these groups could choose to be registered under 527 as a PAC, they don't want to do so because they would have to disclose their donors. Am I correct in that?
That is correct.
And not putting you in a spot where you have to try to figure out what happened in the past. Was that part of the problem, that people were doing this and therefore there had to be some scrutiny, and maybe that scrutiny went overboard?
Well, as I say, I have not spent a lot of time looking backwards because we got 6 investigations going on. There was an increase after the Supreme Court case in 2010 in organizations and the flow of money into public discussion and debate and political activities. So the volume went up to some extent. It became more visible. Back to the question, for a long time, nobody paid much attention because most of these organizations weren't particularly visible as you go forward. But I do think that, again, if the process is clear, then people who meet the process ought to be able to make that choice. But a major factor in the choice, I understand, is that if you were a 527, you could spend all your time and money on political activity, but contributions would be visible. If you're a 501c4, social welfare organization, you can only spend a certain percentage of your time, and nobody's quite known what the percentage is, but you have to be primarily a social welfare organization, not engaged in whatever is the definition of political activity.
Now, do you think that, or maybe I missed something, do your rules define once and for all what is political activity, or do you think we'll reach the day when we can define what is political activity?
Well, that's the whole purpose of the draft, and that's the whole purpose of the 100,000 comments back and the public debate, which I think is an important one, about what should be the definition and how much of that, whatever the definition is, how much of that activity should you be allowed to do before you jeopardize your status as a social welfare organization. And it's not a simple, it's a simple set of questions. It's a complicated issue is to figure out how to deal with that in a way, as I say, that's fair to everybody. I don't think we should be in some way, I think the criticism needs to be considered in the comments, that we ought to make sure that this applies fairly to people and is not viewed as singling out any particular group of people, which is why you also have to take a look at which sections of the 501c statute will, whatever rule, if there is one comes out, apply to. And so those are important, difficult questions. As I say, somebody new to the game, my goal would be, as I say, if it's clear, fair, and most importantly, easy to administer, it'll be better for the IRS, and it'll ultimately be better for the groups that meet those standards and are operating, because they ought not to, 2 or 3 years down the road, have to be continually trying to figure out, well, what's this really mean? And that's my concern about the facts and circumstances. Always have you in a position of trying to judge, well, what are the facts and circumstances? How have they changed? What's somebody going to say? And it just seems to me that's not good for them, and it doesn't do us any good. It gets us involved in a lot of decisions that I think we'd be better off not making.
One quick last question. I supported including $200,000 in the appropriations bill for training for enforcement employees in the exempt organizations unit. Please explain how you will use these funds to prevent the type of problems experienced previously from happening in the future.
Training is important. I know there's been a concern about it, and I think I share that concern that we train appropriately. The training session that went on was in 2010, and OMB at 2011 and 12 has made it clear that those sessions aren't going to happen, and they have to be approved at a very high level. In the particular case of 501c4s, in response to the IG recommendations, we provide clearer guidance to employees. We've provided more training. One of the recommendations was to provide training before any election, so we will make sure that people understand what's appropriate and not appropriate in terms of reviewing these organizations as we go forward. And so we're comfortable that while the standard is still facts and circumstances, which is a little hard to know about, we're comfortable that we have much better training and much better visibility and oversight of this issue. Before, it goes back to the 50 years, nobody paid a lot of attention to it, which is, I think, part of the problem.
Well, I thank you for your testimony. I thank you for appearing here today. I know you have a very difficult job ahead of you, but if it makes you feel any better, understand that all the years I've been in public office, and it's 40 now, I've always known, and before that the IRS was never a very popular agency to begin with. That and the INS were right up there with some folks. So yes, you have a challenge to bring back the confidence the president wants, but no, this is not new. There's been a distrust for many years of the IRS by the public, and this is something we have to keep working on. So thank you so much for your service.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Amadeo?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Commissioner, thank you for your answers, and I appreciate that. I guess I want to just, a couple of things. One is when we talk about transparency and all that other sort of stuff, any plans to release the learner emails to any of the other committees in the near future? And let me tell you why I'm asking that.
Oh, that's a good question.
The context of the proposed regulation, the context timing-wise that it comes forward in, is something that I don't think anybody in this room can ignore. So actually, you know, the 50 years may not be very important, but on the heels of what has happened in 501c4s, and then, because if that hadn't come to light, the IG probably wouldn't have taken a look into that. And if that hadn't come to light, you know, so you sit here and you say, going forward, and I respect that, we want to be open, transparent, all that other sort of stuff. But when you say, and by the way, as part of that, we're going to define political activity, and God bless you for your courage. Sounds about like defining obscenity to me, and the Supreme Court had a hell of a time trying to do that a long time ago. So good luck. I mean, I wish you success. But I sit there and look at that and say, the timing of when this is going, and we are going to define political activity, with all due respect, that's something the legislative branch probably ought to undertake if it needs to be done, because the regulation will have the effect of subsuming whatever the 50-year-old law is when you define political activity in the executive branch, and we're sitting here trying to go, I agree with it, disagree with it. If that needs to be done, then we ought to have this debate, with all due respect.
No,
so,
right.
when are those learner emails going to those other meaner committees than this one, Mr.
First,
Commissioner?
I would just correct slight technicality. What's been in place for 50 years is the regulation. In other words, in 1959, it was an IRS regulation that set in motion the definitions that we have today. The law has been there for a long period, longer than that. But you're exactly right. Even if we end up with a regulation, the Congress always has the authority to either change the statute or overrule the regulation. So it's not as if the IRS and Treasury have, you know, carte blanche to do whatever they want. With regard to the investigations, I'm in the process of having further conversations with Chairman Camp of the House Ways and Means Committee about just your question. And we are anxious to provide, as I told Chairman Camp when I met with him about a month ago, and he gave me, which I think was very helpful, a list of things that were the last items or the items that they needed to have to get to closure. We're very anxious to get him all the information he needs to make his decisions. And so we're working with the committees. We're working with the Senate Finance Committee as well, and the other committees. We have 4 congressional ones going forward, and
I appreciate that.
And we want to satisfy them that they have the information they need to reach the determination they're making about the determination process.
But let me tell you why I think it's important. It's not important in terms of who did what to who or who shot the sheriff. It's important in terms of looking at this regulatory proposed action and going, was this a flaw in the regulation, or was this something out of the ordinary for purposes, because, I mean, to listen to this today, it's like, yeah, we're changing the regulation. Not you, but I mean generally. So anyhow, I think it's important in terms of examining how the existing regulatory body was working before this latest issue came up, not in terms of who got caught doing whatever. So with that, I thank you, look forward to visiting with you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Yeah. Let me just say a couple of things to make sure we have clarity. The regulation was drafted pursuant to and after the IG report, and the IG report was in, my understanding, had been underway when the IRS acknowledged that it in fact had been inappropriately highlighting organizations for review in the 503C4 area. But the IG investigation had been going on for some months, and the draft of the regulation was a recommendation from the IG. But it's still, you're exactly right, we need to actually provide as much transparency as we can. My goal on the investigations, as I say, is to do whatever we can to get all of the investigators the information they need for the determination process. When you start a new investigation saying, well, I'd like to actually know what about the regulatory process, that's, you know, a different investigation than what we've been dealing with for the last 8 to 10 months. And my only thought about that is we're happy to try to get you information about that, but we can't do a series of investigations all at the same time.
I guess it would be nice to have a rule to just say you can't pick out people based on their political philosophy and bully them and intimidate them and harass them. That would be a pretty clear rule, but
I think
guess,
that's the rule.
well, I guess that got violated.
And I think there's investigations going on to find out exactly whether they were and how.
Let me recognize Mr. Yoder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And at this point, I'd be happy to yield to Mr. Serrano to say anything else nice he'd like to say about me. I mean, I don't know if you ran out of time. I'd be happy to provide additional time for you.
Don't push it.
All right, okay. I want to thank my friend Mr. Serrano for his comments, and as you can see on that issue, we have strong bipartisan support. I know we have your assurances that we're going to try to fix that. There are a lot of issues I think that we agree on in this committee that and across Congress that don't always get the media headlines, and so it's nice to find more and more of those that we can work together on to fix in this country. I appreciate Mr. Serrano and other folks on both sides of the aisle working on that and other issues, and I want to give another one I think that maybe we'd have some bipartisan agreement on, and this comes from a constituent as I asked, what question should I ask the IRS commissioner, right? This could be fun. What would you like me to ask? And I think this is a very important question and one probably felt by a lot of Americans. We've talked this morning about the trust deficit that exists between the Internal Revenue Service and Americans, particularly in light of what I will term as much more egregious than maybe we've heard from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle this morning, the abuse of the code to attack people based on ideology. And we're going to continue to investigate not only your investigations you have internally, sir, but here within Congress, serious investigations, and people need to be held accountable more so than they have been. But that being said, John, a CPA in my district, asked that makes the point that he's a CPA and the tax code is very difficult to navigate. I think we would all agree with that. 4 million words, 10,000 pages. How can the IRS make it easier for qualified preparers and regular taxpayers to efficiently manage their taxes and provide quality service with the threat, without the threat of onerous penalties for unintentional oversights or misinterpretations or unintentional errors? And additionally, how can there be less of an adversarial relationship between the professionals and the IRS when dealing with problem taxpayers as well? Absent new dollars, because it's not just a function of money, how can you operate the IRS in a different way to improve that relationship, which, as you can imagine, for even a CPA or a regular hardworking American who has to pay their taxes, it's a nightmare trying to figure out how to sort through all this. Many of us in this country, I think on both sides of the aisle, believe we need tax reform, and I'd like your comments on that, sir.
Well, as I told the chairman earlier, I strongly believe in tax simplification, tax reform to make it easier for people to figure out how much they owe. I mean, most Americans just, if you could tell them what they owe, are happy to pay it, or not overly happy, but willing to pay it. But when you impose all sorts of complexity and make it difficult, they get a little less happy. We have I think, an important partnership with preparers and those who are qualified. We're always concerned about unregulated preparers around the periphery who sometimes engage in fraud, sometimes are educated and really don't provide good service. But for people like your constituent, we have a lot of programs trying to reach out to preparers, trying to provide them as much information as we can. I would hope that as we make the website more user-friendly, it used to be clunky in the extreme, and we're spending some of our resources there because we do think it's important for taxpayer service. But we value the work that preparers do. As I say, they're our outreach to clients. If we can have them comfortable that they understand the intricacies of the tax code, it'll make it easier for their clients. One of the things we have a special tax preparer line you can call. One of our concerns there is even there, the resource constraints have made people, we've heard from preparers that they have to sit on the line longer. And I don't think that's fair to them. I mean, they've got businesses to run. If they have to wait half an hour, 45 minutes to get there on the special line, if they've got 5 or 6 clients, I mean, they could waste a significant amount of time. So all I can say is we value the preparer community. We'll continue to reach out to them. Best thing we can do for them is to try to provide them as much information as guidance as we can, and we'll keep doing that.
And it's, sir, it's also a function of style, and as you know, they take their cues from the person leading the organization, and so efforts that you can make to ensure that the relationships are less adversarial and more supportive. I think we see this at all levels of the federal government, where Americans feel that these federal agencies are not there to work with them, but rather to work against them.
Right.
And this is a common problem at every agency, and I hope that you'll do your best to try to fix those problems at the IRS.
Right. Well, one of the advantages of this tour I'm on is I do get to talk to people doing the work. And as I say, in Philadelphia, I had a very nice and a very productive meeting with a half a dozen revenue agents and revenue officers. And that's where I got the willing to pay, unwilling to pay distinction. And their point, these are revenue officers you think are sort of banging on your door to collect, who are saying, we need to make sure that if you're willing to pay and you just have difficulties, that we work with you, that we don't actually make you feel uncomfortable. And in fact, their concern is the biggest problem they have is a lot of times people don't respond to notices from the IRS because they're very nervous about it and concerned. And their point was we ought to have a way of making sure people understand that if you're just having trouble paying your taxes, we're going to try to work with you. The people we don't like are the people who, in fact, are consciously trying to avoid paying taxes, trying to hide their assets, moving around the country, engaged in fraud. Those people, we don't have to be very nice to. But I think the point is well taken. If there's an honest mistake made, if people didn't understand things, they're trying to pay, we ought to have a productive working relationship with them.
And then, if I might, just Chairman, one real quick budgetary question. Mr. Amade asked this question earlier in a different way, but I'd like to know, and maybe you could just follow up with information for the committee, how many hours and how many dollars have been spent related to the controversy created by the investigation related to 501c4 groups last year, and the reforms or the changes that you're looking at now. And I know you said it was less than 1% of your budget. If you could let us know the impact. I know this is prior to your time there, but these things do have an impact on time that could be spent elsewhere, number one. And then number two, how much money has been spent and how much are you needing and requesting related to the enforcement of the Affordable Care Act? And the impact that's having on your agency. I know several years ago and throughout their hearings, the IRS has repeatedly asked for hundreds of millions of more dollars to hire more agents to go out to make sure that small businesses and Americans are following the new big government mandates on them regarding this law. And I'd like to know the cost to the IRS and and where you're funding those resources.
Yeah, I can answer that question because it is a question I've been asking, and that is the 2014 presidential budget for the IRS proposed $440 million for the Affordable Care Act. $330 million of that was for information technology. None of that funding was provided, so we are actually, one of the constraints we have is we have to pay for the IT, particularly out of other IT projects we otherwise would have funded as we go forward. The $100 million is primarily for preparing for and dealing with information issues, designing of the systems, making sure that they work. It is, as you can imagine, one of the reasons it's my priority is I am committed that we will at this time next year have an effective filing season, which means we will be effectively implementing our responsibilities under the Affordable Care Act. We did that at the front end. The rollout difficulties were not IRS difficulties. It's a major challenge, and we're finding the funds. It's one of the things that we have to then find in other areas of the IRS.
Just a clarification point, Mr. Chairman. So the amount requested was $440. How much does the IRS spend annually and on the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, and how much does it project to spend in the next years?
I can get you that in terms of what we've spent for the last couple of years, what we're spending this year, and what our estimate is for next year. Obviously, one of the issues that's going to happen to us, as I've talked to the, people about, is that starting late in the fall, but certainly during filing season next year, because it's a new requirement, we're going to have a lot of inquiries from preparers as well as taxpayers if they are in the area of being eligible for a premium tax credit, and even if they aren't, making sure they are comfortable filling out that return. And we've started that public information campaign this week. We'll spend all the rest of this year trying to, again, get preparers and taxpayers comfortable that they understand. Now, 70 or 80% of the taxpayers aren't going to have anything to do with it at all. They're just going to check a box, say, I've got insurance, and they'll move on their way. So a big chunk of people won't be affected by it. But we'll get you, I'd be delighted to get you and the committee the information about, over the last 2 or 3 years, how much have we spent for IT or personnel on affordable care? What are we spending this year, and what do we expect the requirements are going to be in the next year or two?
I'm sure that that when you next appear before us, then there'll be a lot of discussion about the dollars that are necessary. Thank you. Ms. Herr Butler?
I wanted to ask about bonuses really quickly. We had, in making sure that bonuses are being given to employees who actually have shown improved performance or goals that they've met. Did you, I don't know if you've seen, have you taken, we put some report language together. Have you taken our guidance within the House report language to ensure the bonuses would be awarded to those who actually show improved employee performance and productivity?
That's there are performance awards. The pool is 1% of compensation. The performance judgments are made by managers, not by the employees themselves, obviously. And the history is that those awards have gone to about 2/3 of the employees, so 1/3 don't get any. The average size of those awards is about $1,200, so nobody's making a lot of money. And if I could hold her time, if I could respond to the 1%, in terms of how did I come to this decision. After the decision was made last year trying to reach the sequester levels that performance awards would not be paid to IRS employees, OMB had issued an government-wide edict that 1% performance awards could be made. My predecessor decided that while the contract provided with the bargaining unit performance awards, a pool of 1.75%, that we thought negotiating ability to change that number, and the number went to 0. The union then, understandably, filed a grievance, an unfair labor practice, and a lawsuit, all of which were pending when I started. In the course of negotiating a new agreement, which we're in the process of, and I hope sometime in the near future we'll have that agreement settled, we've been negotiating about what the performance pool ought to be going forward.
When you say the performance pool, what does that mean?
That means
like the number of people that are eligible?
The bargaining unit is whatever thousands of employees it is, and you take the salary, and then the question is, what is the performance award pool? It doesn't go to every employee, and
So wait a minute, these aren't merit-based employee,
these are performance awards based on merit. They're determined by the manager, but the size of the pool available for awards was set by the contract at 1.75%.
So that meant, that's a floor. That many will get a performance award?
No, 1.75% was the pool. Then each individual bargaining unit was evaluated, a judgment was made, and as I say, about 2/3 of them were eligible for awards, performance awards. The average award was about $1,200. 1/3 of them were not eligible because they had not performed, determined by their manager. And the question is, what's the size of the pool, or whether there would be a pool at all? The decision was no pool. We ultimately negotiated a settlement with the union that they would drop the grievance, the unfair labor practice, and they would drop the lawsuit, and we would pay not 1.75 into a pool for performance awards, but 1%. In terms of how we are able to do that, we had in our budget, post-sequester, funding for that because as a result of the sequester, we've actually lost another 1,300 people, and on an annualized basis, that provides us part of the revenues we need. We've made more assumptions about cuts in our other overhead expenses of about 4%. And the arrangement with the union is that we won't pay those awards in the fiscal year the way we've always done it. We pay managers 2 or 3 months after the fiscal year into the next one. So we're moving the bargaining unit awards into the next fiscal year. So this year we are only going to pay 1 pool award. There won't be 2, and that's how it fits within the budget. So we had...
So can I, really quickly, reclaiming my time, I
was going to give you back 2 minutes if there was the chairman's approval.
what I'm interested in understanding is not what I think if someone's eligible for an award because they've shown, based on their merit and their hard work, that they deserve it. I'm fine with that.
Good.
My issue is understanding. You said that the managers make the decision. So I assume you have, you've issued guidance whereby they can use, some kind of criteria to make this.
Yes,
and
there are.
and
There's an agency-wide performance plan run by the Human Capital Office.
And then there's a follow-up for quality control to make sure that it's not a manager saying, right, so that people have actually met these awards, because we've seen people receive these performance awards who, for crying out loud, are the subject of investigations. So I guess I want to make sure that moving forward, that these awards are appropriate? That's where my question is.
I've asked that question myself to make sure that for managers as well as bargaining unit employees, when we pay a performance award, we need to be comfortable that the system is actually rewarding performance. Employees know who's performing and who's not, and if you're making awards to people who aren't performing, that's not good for morale either. So we have a very sophisticated system, and I think your point is well taken that we need to, and I've said the same thing, we need to evaluate it to make sure that we're comfortable that this just is like woebegone and everybody's above average, that basically we need to be rewarding performance. And that's my final reason for making this decision. We could do it within the budget, and these are, again, employees who haven't had a pay raise in 4 years. I've been subject to a lot of difficulties over the last year. And ultimately, as I say, 75% of our budget is people. Without the people, the work isn't going to get done. Part of the reason I'm out wandering around the country in the middle of the wintertime is to remind those employees who are dedicated to the mission that we value their work. They are terrifically dedicated. Some of them have been around 20, 25, 30 years working on this area. And their only concern is, can we get them the resources so they could provide better taxpayer service? So if in the course of settling with the union and saving us the risk of having to pay more in that pool and being able to time it in a different way, I can send a signal to the employees that we value their work. It seemed to me that was appropriate.
All right. With that, I yield back.
Anybody have any other questions? I think we're about ready to move into panel 2. So let me just say to you, Commissioner, thank you. I know how busy you are. Thank you for being here today. And we know what a difficult job you have, and I think sometimes we lose sight of the good things that the IRS does, that you do every day under difficult circumstances. So collecting the revenues, talking to folks, answering questions, chasing down the bad guys, all the things that you do every day, we very much appreciate. And we're here to help you do that even better. So thank you for the time. This concludes the first panel, and we'll have the second panel come along. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, let me welcome our second panel today. I want to thank you for your patience and for being with us today. We appreciate both your time and your expertise. And so I'm pleased to welcome back the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, Russell George, to share his observations of compliance and recommendations about the efficiency of the IRS. Since the IRS is the largest Treasury Bureau, then TICTA is accordingly the largest of the three Treasury Inspector Generals. And to much is given, then much is expected. And so we are relying on your office and your counsel to help us assess and understand the IRS's management and use of taxpayers' funds. So welcome back, Inspector George. I'm also pleased to welcome back Nina Olson, the National Taxpayer Advocate. This is your first appearance before the subcommittee since 2007. So I'm hoping today we can hear from you and about your services and what you provide to the taxpayers, what you're doing to help those taxpayers who may have been victims of tax fraud and abuse, how the IRS can make the most of its funding. So welcome, Ms. Olson. And so I appreciate the service of both of you all. Look forward to your testimony. But first, let me yield to Mr. Serrano, the ranking member, for any opening statement he'd like to make.
I also want to welcome you both here. We just had a very interesting conversation with the commissioner, and I'd be interested to hear, Mr. George, and what your recommendations are and how things are falling into place or not. And of course, from you, Ms. Olson, on how we can better serve the public and maybe bring down some of that fear everybody has of the IRS. And so we thank you, and we look forward to your testimony.
Start by asking both of you all a question. Oh, I'm sorry. I would like to ask you to make your opening statements. I got carried away. Mr. Serrano was so brief, I got so confused. But please, take your time and tell us what yes, he's very confused. So, Mr. George, would you begin?
Thank you, Chairman Crenshaw. Ranking Member Serrano, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss significant challenges currently facing the Internal Revenue Service. Let me start with the topic of providing quality customer service, which is the first step to achieving taxpayer compliance. We have seen a decline in the IRS's ability to provide a sufficient level of customer service in each of the channels that taxpayers use, including telephone, walk-in, and correspondence. Many taxpayers use the telephone to contact the IRS. Meeting demand with reduced staffing continues to be a struggle, resulting in long wait times, abandoned calls, and taxpayers redialing the IRS toll-free telephone lines for service. At its walk-in offices, known as Taxpayer Assistance Centers, the IRS has decided to eliminate certain services, such as tax return preparation, that can be obtained through other channels. The IRS assisted over 6.5 million taxpayers at these service centers in fiscal year 2013, but plans to reduce that number by 14% this year. The IRS's ability to process taxpayer correspondence in a timely manner has also declined. The backlog of paper correspondence inventories has substantially increased. The overage inventory rose from approximately 593,000 at the end of 2012 to almost 1.2 million at the end of 2013. As with all federal agencies, the IRS is required to estimate the amount of improper payments made each year and report to Congress on the causes of and steps taken to reduce these payments. The IRS limits its reporting to improper payments associated with the Earned Income Tax Credit. However, in our view, the IRS's assessment should also include payments due to refund fraud, such as identity theft. Tax fraud-related identity theft continues to be a growing problem, which results in billions of dollars in improper payments. The total impact is significantly greater than the amount the IRS detects and prevents. Using the characteristics of tax returns that the IRS confirmed as involving identity theft, we analyzed tax year 2011 returns and identified approximately 1.1 million undetected returns that have potentially fraudulent refunds, totaling approximately $3.6 billion. While this is a decrease of $1.6 billion from the prior year, indicating that the IRS is making progress, significant improvements are still needed. Expanded access to the National Directory of New Hires could immediately provide the IRS with information needed to make substantial improvements in its fraud detection efforts. Legislation is needed to expand the IRS's authority to access this data. The tax gap is also a continuing challenge. The most recent IRS assessment is that the gross tax gap is about $450 billion annually. Most of this amount, $376 billion, is attributable to taxpayers underreporting their tax liability. The law provides for certain new reporting requirements, including merchant card reporting and foreign account reporting, to help the IRS identify unreported income. TICTA will be evaluating and the implementation of these requirements this year. Implementation of tax law changes associated with the Affordable Care Act will also present many challenges for the IRS in the coming years. For example, the Affordable Care Act provides for a refundable tax credit known as the premium tax credit to offset an individual's health insurance expenses. As with other refundable credits, there is a risk of improper payments. Further, in September 2013, we reported that a fraud mitigation strategy is not in place to guide Affordable Care Act systems development, testing, initial deployment, and long-term operations. The IRS informed us that 2 new systems are under development that will address fraud risk. However, until these new systems are successfully developed and tested, TICTA remains concerned that the IRS existing fraud detection system may not be capable of identifying and preventing refund fraud. We are also concerned about the protection of confidential taxpayer data that will be provided to the exchanges. Our review of the IRS's customer service strategy determined that it provides sufficient plans to assist individuals in understanding the tax implications of the Affordable Care Act. The IRS's role in providing customer service in this area will become more prominent in 2015. We will continue to monitor and correct any problems early in the process. Chairman Crenshaw, Ranking Member Serrano, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to share my views.
Thank you. Ms. Olson?
Chairman Crenshaw, Ranking Member Serrano, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for holding this hearing and inviting me to testify today. As you know, the IRS has faced some significant management and funding challenges over the last year. In my written testimony, I have outlined both the IRS's progress and my continuing concerns regarding exempt organization applications and implementation of the Affordable Care Act. Today, I will focus on 4 other areas of particular concern. First, I believe it is critical that we adopt a taxpayer Bill of Rights. From time to time, the IRS, which is fundamentally an enforcement agency, will do things that are administratively convenient for itself but not fair to taxpayers. In fact, in the preface of my June report to Congress, I analyzed the IRS's actions in dealing with organizations seeking tax-exempt status under 501c4 in the context of the 10 rights I have proposed, and I concluded the IRS's actions would have violated 8 of those rights. The enactment of a taxpayer Bill of Rights constitutes one important step to prevent similar situations from arising in the future. I am pleased that the House of Representatives passed the Bill of Rights I have proposed on a voice vote last summer, and I hope the Senate acts too, because I think that the taxpayer Bill of Rights should have the force of law. But the IRS itself has the authority to adopt a taxpayer Bill of Rights, and in case the Senate does not act, I have been working with the IRS leadership to try to get agreement to do so. Second, I am deeply concerned about the decline in the IRS's ability to meet the service needs of the taxpaying public. Even with the widespread use of tax preparers, the IRS received more than 109 million telephone calls on its customer service lines last year. Among taxpayers seeking to talk to a live assister, the IRS could not answer 2 out of every 5 calls. And those taxpayers who got through had to wait an average of 17.6 minutes on hold. For the first 4 months of the current fiscal year, the IRS is running behind last year's pace, and to make matters worse, the IRS has announced it will only answer basic tax law questions on its phone lines and in its walk-in sites until April 15th, and then I repeat, no tax law questions at all after April 15th, including questions from millions of taxpayers who obtain filing extensions and prepare their returns later in the year. In the light of events of the past year, I understand that calls for more IRS funding may meet with skepticism, but I must tell you that I don't see any way the agency can begin to meet taxpayer needs without more funding. At the end of the day, IRS funding reductions don't punish the IRS. Instead, they punish the nearly 150 million individual taxpayers and more than 10 million business entity taxpayers who are trying their best to comply with the monstrously complex tax code we have imposed on them and who are not receiving the help they need from their government. Thus, as you start to make funding decisions for fiscal year 2015, I implore you to keep in mind the nearly 20 million phone calls the IRS didn't answer last year, the tens of million taxpayers who had to wait on hold for an average of nearly 18 minutes, often after calling several times, and the IRS's new policy of not answering many tax law questions. If we don't do a better job of assisting taxpayers, non-compliance will increase and taxpayers and the public fisc will be harmed. Third, while the IRS is doing a better job of detecting and stopping identity theft and other refund fraud returns, I remain concerned that victims of tax-related identity theft are not being assisted as quickly and as seamlessly as they could. I have recommended for many years that the IRS provide victims with a single employee who would serve as his or her sole contact and who would coordinate cross-functional work to resolve cases more quickly and painlessly. The IRS should stop dithering and just do this. Fourth, in my written testimony, I provide a detailed analysis of the sources of earned income tax credit errors and make practical, concrete proposals for reducing the improper payment rate, even as we ensure that eligible taxpayers are not deterred from receiving the EITC. These recommendations include emphasizing personal contact during audits, regulating tax preparers to improve return accuracy and protect taxpayers, imposing penalties on preparers who fail to comply with due diligence requirements, using a third-party affidavit form to verify the residence of a child in the EITC audits, and accelerating the use of third-party information reports so the IRS can verify income data before paying out refunds. This last recommendation will help address identity theft, refund fraud, and improper payments combined, namely that Congress direct the IRS to develop a plan to enable it to match information return data against tax return data before paying out refunds. At the same time, it could make the data available to taxpayers and thereby help them prepare their returns more accurately and easily. I appreciate this opportunity to share my thoughts with you, and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Well, thank you very much. Thank both of you all. And let's ask a few questions. And it's interesting to me to hear both of you all talk about the fact that one thing the IRS doesn't do very well, and that is answer the telephone. And we just had the commissioner before us, and it was one of my main concerns as I talked to him. And I know it's always easy to just say, if we had more money, we could hire more people, we could answer the phone more. But as I told him, when you have $11.3 billion, then you have to decide how to spend the money. And it seems to me that one of the priorities ought to be kind of customer service. And when you look through the entire budget, somehow, some way, you ought to be able to find the money to do the things that are most important. And if that is it's kind of the face of the IRS, answering the telephone. If you only get half the calls answered, and when you get answered, you wait 20 minutes, somewhere, somehow, in all of that $11 billion, there ought to be money. And I told the commissioner it bothered me to find $63 million was paid out as bonuses, reversing a decision that his predecessor had made because there wasn't enough money. But those are the kind of priority decisions that are being made, and that's what we talked about today. So maybe, particularly Ms. Osum, maybe as the taxpayer advocate, as you advocate for those people that are trying to get through to the IRS, maybe there's some things that you can do as you look through that $11 billion and say, here's an idea about how you could save some money here, whether it's in your computer contracts or your rentals. And I know they will say they're saving money, they're doing, and I appreciate that because it's tough. But still, it seems like you got to do the most important things first of all. And I hope maybe both of you all can assist us in finding places where there is a little more money to move to the customer service side, and we'll see how that goes. Let me just very quickly ask you all, because we had these recommendations that were made, particularly Mr. George. We had the scandal going on, and the recommendations that we made, each of you actually made them, and the President said they're going to implement those. So tell us how the IRS is doing in implementing each of those recommendations in general, and tell us, do you believe that some of the groups that are applying for tax-exempt status, are there people still being subjected to this kind of bullying and scrutiny? And then finally, what work do you plan to do to kind of make sure that this doesn't go on any further? So maybe if each of you could kind of touch on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I may start first. The IRS has reported to us that they have adopted all of the 9 recommendations that we issued in our report on the inappropriate treatment of certain groups seeking the tax-exempt status. We are in the process now of engaging in a review to determine the adequacy of the corrective actions that the IRS purports to have taken. We're in the middle of that. I don't have a deadline yet as to when we'll complete that, but one of the issues that we did recommend was catching up on a backlog of these applications that were still outstanding. And so, as my comments suggest, there are still outstanding applications for people, groups rather, seeking an up or down from the IRS. I don't know, I wasn't here for the entire portion of the Commissioner's comments, but I know in private has acknowledged that that is the case and that is a priority, but our report will give a thorough response as to the adequacy of their response to our recommendations.
We have been really closely focusing on the process of getting an exempt or application through, which creates some of the backlog, the amount of review that they were doing or the steps that they were taking. And we've been working very closely with them. We have also trained my employees so they do better advocacy when they get cases in, and we have seen a significant number of cases. We have issued a significant number of taxpayer assistance orders on these cases, including several that involved C4s where we felt we were not getting the attention. Most of it was timeliness, getting a decision. Something that my organization really focused on was that the key point in Mr. George's report, where people were asking for guidance from the frontline employees were asking for guidance on these issues for over a year, and no guidance was coming back. And we found that the exempt organization function had no process for tracking the age of these guidance requests, for tracking the request and saying, this is 3 months old, this is 6 months old. And when you leave employees to their own devices for a year and the backlog is continuing to they're going to come up with a solution. And we all know what that solution was, a BOLO list. And so we've really been focusing with them to be responsive on their guidance, to track the guidance so they have the management controls in place, and as well to look at their process and say, what do you really need to know? I would comment, if I could, on the prior discussion about the regulations. I spent a fair amount of time over the last week really looking at the proposed regulations. And I think what I saw in that was the IRS responding to a recommendation of mine, and I think Mr. George's, is get greater clarity, see if there's some bright line tests you can do. But when you go to the bright line tests, they're winners and losers. And you have that trade-off of doing facts and circumstances, which is subjective in a way, versus bright line test, which is objective, but you're going to get some results that we may not want to get. So I view these regs as an opportunity to begin a dialogue with people and hear back what the country really wants in these organizations.
Well, it's interesting to hear that perspective, because I do think there's, as you probably know, they're expecting 100,000. They've already had over 90,000 comments. One of the most controversial, toxic proposals ever been made. The good news from hearing the commissioner say, at least in his opinion, they wouldn't be put in place anytime soon, but he didn't really say when. But I think your point that there ought to be a lot of dialogue about that, because it certainly may have a chilling effect on these elections coming up now, and it certainly is arguable that people's freedom of speech could be limited. So it's very important, I think, as we go down that road. So thanks for that. Mr. Serrano?
Thank you, and thank you both for your testimony. Mr. George, your lead investigator reviewed 5,500 emails and concluded that there was no indication of political motivation. Yet you failed to mention this until months after your audit was published. Furthermore, you never mentioned that progressive groups were targeted for scrutiny as well. Your report repeatedly emphasized the Tea Party and other conservative groups while using the term other to refer to the 2/3 of the applications that were examined that did not involve Tea Party groups. External studies of similar information found that terms like progressive and occupy were also used as part of the inappropriate criteria in subjecting groups to extra scrutiny. Are you concerned about how your initial report has been used? Do you think you should have been more forthcoming or comprehensive in your analysis? At last year's hearing, I thought that you said you plan to take another look at the groups that you have done. Have you done so? And I should have prefaced my comments by saying that I join my colleagues in denouncing anything that went wrong in terms of scrutinizing people and groups, but your report indicates basically that it was the Tea Party, when in fact it has been proven that there were other groups, and we want to know why you omitted that and why you did not clarify it later on when it was known not to be the case.
There are obviously a number of issues there, and I beg your indulgence, Mr. Serrano, I may ask you to repeat, one or two of them. But let me start with the initial comment that you made, and that is about the email indicating 5,000 plus groups. It was during the course of the initial report when I was informed by staff that there existed a quote-unquote smoking gun memo, which I haven't seen, which purported to say, hey, IRS do this as it relates to the groups that were the subject of this, for lack of a better word, treatment by the groups and the determination groups in Cincinnati, and as we subsequently learned, some of the people in Washington. My auditors indicated to me that they had such a number of emails that they did not have the wherewithal to go through those. My Office of Investigations did have software which would allow them to do a quick scan search to see if that memorandum existed and could be located. And so I did not learn about the memo that you noted in your comment until I was literally sitting in a hearing. I believe it was before the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, and so was not aware that that assertion was made by the Deputy for Investigations. And so for it, and I'm not going to say that it's invalid, his conclusions, but I was just as surprised to learn about that conclusion as many others were. So it's not that I was hiding anything. It was that I was unaware that that review of the documents had been completed and that that was the opinion of that member of my staff. Now, as it relates to progressive groups,
So this was a member of your staff who came to this conclusion but didn't tell you?
did not tell me directly, correct. That is correct. Now, as it relates to whether progressive groups, you have to keep in mind, sir, this was an extraordinarily fluid a period in which we found ourselves. And it was literally 6:30 p.m. the night before my first testimony before the Senate Finance Committee, in which my former chief counsel indicated that there was a hidden tab in one of the documents that the IRS had supplied to us that indicated that there were other be on the lookout lists. These lists, at that time, we had no idea until then, at least I didn't, that it existed, but we certainly did not have any indication as to how they were being used. Now, from the outset of our review, we did know that groups with the names Tea Party, 9/11, and Patriot were being identified using BOLOs, and that the IRS had set those aside for special processing. Now, when we learned about the existence of these other BOLOs with Progressive and a few other names on it, there are two factors. One, and this is the key, Title 26, Section 6103 of the United States Code has criminal penalties if I or anyone else with access to that information releases the names or in effect its tax return information with very limited exceptions. So the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee can receive that, and the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee can receive that information without restriction. No other committee, including this one, has access to that information. And if I were to reveal that information, not knowing, one, whether they were protected by Section 6103, could be subject to penalty. And so in the late hour of receiving that information and during the course of that period, while we're trying to determine what, if anything, the IRS did with this information, I felt it best we had our facts in place before opening up what could have been a big issue and what could not have been a big issue. We did not know at that time. And lastly,
Yeah, but let me tell you what troubles me about your testimony. It seems, unless I'm hearing it incorrectly, and that's possible, that you knew early, according to your report, that certain groups were being targeted, but you found out other things the night before you were ready to testify. And so I have to ask myself, how come you were not aware in your investigation, in the ongoing investigation, that other groups and other issues were at play? It seems to me from what I heard from you on two occasions, is that right before you were ready to testify, you found out about this or found out about that or were told that that was taking place or not. Yet, my big question to you was, are you now ready, or have you done anything in the past few months to say more than the Tea Party was targeted, if you will? And remember, sir, that I'm one of those liberal Democrats who denounced this practice if it did exist, while also saying that there are people who have misused these breaks they get by not having to put forth who their donors are. And that's at the bottom, or at the center of the problem. So you're not talking to one who is defending everything that happened, but it seems to me that you're not telling me either everything you know now or everything you've done to correct the misconception that went out there that only certain groups were targeted, when in fact that's not what happened, and that's not been the history of this country anyway.
Fair, I understand what you're saying, sir, but there is something that I neglected to mention at the outset of my response, and that is the very evening, so it must have been around 7 p.m., the night before that first testimony, I instructed my auditors to open up an audit, to determine how these other groups were treated. And we are in the process of engaging in that review. Now, just to be clear, there's an ongoing FBI investigation, and so we are restricted in terms of the people to whom we can speak.
About all groups or about the other groups, as you refer to them?
It's about the initial group of people that we identified. But we are doing an audit, and we have spoken to a few people who have already gone through that process, but I don't have a due date for that. But you have to, and I also need to stress too, sir, that the BOLO list, to be on a lookout list that we identified, that some of which had these progressive groups listed on them, our mandate was to look at the political advocacy or the campaign activities of these groups, approximately 298 of them. And only 3 had the name progressive in them. And I have to, again, I've made this point before, I was not in a position to determine just because a group had the name progressive in it automatically meant that it had one political affiliation or persuasion or another. That was not the purpose of this. Others interpreted it that way. That certainly was not in our report nor in any of my public comments. I've never said that just conservative groups were targeted.
Okay, let me just say this to you. I think that your department made a grave error in going public with, not going public, but with letting people believe that only certain groups were targeted. Because now, even if you fix that and get to the bottom of the truth, the fact is that there's a political issue in this country that's running amok about only certain groups or one certain group being targeted. And we're going to hear from this till the November elections. That's a fact. That's a fact. That's why there'll probably be 1,000 more hearings about the IRS, and most of them will focus not on the budget, but on what happened here. So I just hope you understand that by going the way you did, you might have helped to create this kind of a situation.
If I may, though, Mr. Serrano, because the one thing that's getting kind of lost in all of this, and my audit was not formally complete before Lois Lerner spoke before a group in which she planted a question to ask about this. So it was someone from within the IRS who acknowledged that they engaged in this inappropriate behavior and treatment. The IRS had full access to our audit months before it was released, and they did not question the findings that we ultimately released, and of course then preempted us in terms of releasing that information, which is unprecedented. And so it's not as if we intentionally went out of our way to cast a pall on any particular group, but they acquiesced in this, sir.
Okay. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I know I went
No problem. We'll have time to pursue that. Mr. Yoder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for coming to testify today. We've had an eventful morning, both visiting with the new commissioner and then certainly hearing your updates on what's going on at the IRS. Certainly the last year or so has put the IRS and their rulemaking authority on the front page of nearly every paper in America, and I think many Americans are concerned to this day about the trust deficit that lies between those who are to enforce the law fairly and impartially, and we know that hasn't been occurring. And I know Mr. Serrano and Mr. George, you had a dialogue here. Your point was one that I was going to make, in that I first learned about this back in May of 2013 when Ms. Lerner came out and essentially apologized, said it was inappropriate, and made comments to that regard. And so I think regardless of the original motives, and I think that's what we're still trying to determine is how all this happened, who put these things out, and motivations. Let's talk about what's happened since then. And we're going to go back and relitigate who did what, and we have to continue to do that. But let's, in this moment, I at least want to move forward a bit and say, what are we doing to ensure that this doesn't happen again? We have talked about the 9 recommendations and their implementation. You've, in your testimony, both written and to Chairman's question, has stated they're following the 9 recommendations. I'd like to talk about the 501c4 rules that are now being proposed. There's going to be legislation before the House on this. They are, interestingly, this has become a bipartisan moment of condemnation. You have the ACLU arguing that these are essentially putting a muzzle on public speech, and you have some liberal and conservative groups doing this. I guess one, I'd like to know, are the 501c4 rules that the IRS is proposing, are those the result of your recommendations? And if not, where are they coming from?
One of the proposed recommendations did come directly from our audit report on inappropriate treatment of groups. And that was, we proposed that there would be the guidance on how one should measure the primary activity of a 501c4. All of the other provisions within the proposed rule, we have had no role in developing, sir.
And as these rules are developed, is it your opinion that the Treasury Department can finalize an IRS rule without the approval of the IRS Commissioner?
I am not privy to the procedures that the IRS follows, or rather that the Treasury Department follows, except to say that for over 50 years, there have been guidance or a directive issued by the Secretary of the Treasury, who has deemed that it is the Assistant Secretary of Treasury for Tax Policy who has the ability to determine the final position of the Department of the Treasury as it relates to Internal Revenue Code or tax policy. And so I would have to defer to them in response to that question.
So you're not aware of an instance where the Secretary, the Treasury Secretary would make a rule or regulation in this regard without the consent or the participation of the IRS Commissioner?
As I've never been a part of that, I can't definitively state it, but one can assume that he or she would seek guidance from the Commissioner.
Sir, the current proposed rules are submitted under the signature of the Deputy Commissioner of Enforcement Services and Enforcement in the IRS. So I haven't, I don't know who signs the final rules, but that is what the proposed rules are signed by.
Regarding, sir, your recommendations on how to fix this problem, do you believe if the IRS follows the recommendations of the Inspector General that Congress could sleep at night, they could be rest assured, that the American people could be rest assured and sleep at night knowing that there is no possibility that agents within the IRS could utilize ideology or some other perspective that goes against their mandate that would target individuals in any way, both as individuals for audits or groups for audits? How ironclad are these reforms and these changes to ensure? Because, sir, it's not just on this issue. We have people, essentially there is a chilling effect across the country now of fear of individuals that if they even got involved politically and endorsed Mr. Serrano or the chairman or me or made a donation, that now they're on a list. And that means maybe not today, but some other administration might utilize the subjective powers that exist, that human individuals have, that can be riddled with fraud or error or malfeasance. They could use that to subject them to an audit in the future, and now they have to worry every time they get one. Why are they getting an audit? How do we fix that?
Well, allow me to answer your question, Congressman, by saying, we're dealing with human beings.
Right.
And so we still officially have not had a chance to take a formal review of the implementation that the IRS says it has adopted, and we're going to go one by one through each one to determine to what extent they have complied with what we recommended and any ways that they may have diverted, improved, or not met up to that recommendation. But this is somewhat of an aside, but it is a ironclad rule that IRS employees are not supposed to access the tax return information of people that they officially have no responsibility to work on that particular case. And yet, on a daily basis, they do that, some of them. Not a lot, but some of them do. So you can have the most ironclad rule in place, but you're dealing with human beings who are imperfect or do it.
Well, and I think this is why a lot of Americans are concerned about the IRS getting involved in their health care decisions and determining whether they have the proper health insurance to meet federal mandates, and having that sort of relationship that they might think of with their doctor or someone else in the healthcare world now with an IRS agent, I think scares a lot of people that this agency has become too powerful and it has too many opportunities to commit these types of anti-freedom, anti-American type of actions. And so we're going to continue, hopefully in a bipartisan way. I know my colleagues on both sides of the aisle are concerned about this because it can happen as easily to a conservative group as a liberal group or a group based upon religion or race or anything. And so we've got to root this out no matter where we are and make sure this doesn't ever happen again, and that people don't feel like it could happen. And so your recommendations are an important part of that, and we'll look to move forward on additional recommendations as we try to fix this problem. The second topic is one in which has come up today, both in the Commissioner's hearing and your hearing, is what's the IRS doing to ensure that it has better resources to deal with taxpayer concerns and complaints, to ensure that the phone's being picked up. The chairman made that comment. Others have made the comment regarding your data that it's not being, the responses are pretty weak in terms of handling concerns for consumers. I guess I would like to maybe turn this question a little bit in that, is the problem that we have not enough people to answer all of the questions and concerns that taxpayers have, or is the problem that the code is so cumbersome and riddled with exemptions and loopholes and problems that average everyday working Americans couldn't possibly attempt to figure out on their own, as they have to hire accountants and lawyers, and we've got 4 million words in this code, and it grows by the second with the regulatory side as well. I guess, is the problem that we need more people to answer the problems Americans have with the code, or is the problem in the code itself?
Yes. It's all of the above, Congressman. And I'll defer to Ms. Olson in a moment, but it's a zero-sum game here. I mean, they have a finite amount of resources. They have to make sure that the American people understand how to comply with the tax code. It has been my belief and findings of many of our audit reports that if people understand what the rules are, if the IRS, and this is a key component, and I alluded to this in the testimony, had access to third-party information about the income of people who have tax reporting obligations, that increases dramatically the compliance rate. I use this figure, and I believe I have in previous testimonies before this committee, but it's so important that I feel I have to repeat this. Again, it's a high correlation between tax compliance and third-party information reporting and withholding. The IRS itself estimates that individuals whose wages are subject to withholding report 99% of their wages for tax purposes. Self-employed individuals who operate non-farm businesses are estimated to report only 44% of their income for tax purposes. And the most striking figure, and while it is dated, it's the most up-to-date information that we have, self-employed individuals operating businesses on a cash basis report just 19% of their income for tax purposes. So if the IRS had the ability to gain more information from third parties to attest to the income of the taxpayer, you would have a massive positive impact on reducing the tax gap and increasing the revenue that is due to the federal government. I want to leave enough time for Ms. Olson to respond, but you have to have enforcement. That's the second aspect of it. So the IRS has to be in a position, and whether it's by correspondence audit, most people don't realize that if they receive a letter from the IRS questioning their income tax or their tax return, that's an audit. So an audit is not just some IRS person coming to your office or your home and sitting across from you and going line by line through, receipts and what have you. So, and also a telephone call from the IRS making the same inquiries. That's an audit. So if you don't have those individuals in a position to do that, and most people who are contacted by the IRS do respond. So if they had more resources, more people to be able to do that, I think it would have a very beneficial impact on revenue collection. But
Ms. Olson.
If I think there are a number of things operating here. One is the sheer volume of the work that the IRS has undertaken. Just even its core work has increased dramatically in the last 10 years. The number of phone calls we've received has increased by 53% between fiscal year 2004 and this last fiscal year. So just the volume, our taxpayer service budget hasn't increased that much to be able to meet the demand that taxpayers have. In terms of what the IRS could do to move things get savings in one place and move them to these taxpayer service needs, I think you have to look at the appropriations format itself. We have the two categories of service and enforcement, and then a number of others like IT. And it's very difficult to move dollars between those two. And in the taxpayer service category is essentially the filing season. So all of those 150 million individual returns and 10 million business returns have to be processed. And that's the big chunk of the taxpayer service budget. And what's ever left over is for the phones. And in fact, this last year, because the IRS, one of the reasons why the IRS was able to get its phone level of service even up to the abysmal level of service that it was by taking people off of answering the phones for the automated collection system, where taxpayers were calling in to say, we'd like to pay you money. We took them off of that system and put them on the regular 1040 line just to answer the calls during the filing season. If we hadn't done that, we would have been in much worse shape during the filing season. I think that there are lots of things that the IRS does. I mean, I write a 500, 700-page report every year identifying things that the IRS could do better. And I think one of the things that I spend a lot of time with, and I would encourage this committee to really urge the IRS to look at, is the work that they do up front that creates downstream consequences. That because they're not addressing issues correctly up front or resolving the whole issue up front, you're having many more touches downstream, and that wastes resources, and often those downstream resources are higher graded employees than the person at the first line of contact. And we've done a number of studies actually tracing things through the process to show, what work is generated by not getting that right answer up front. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done in that area. And I think that there's some looking at what are we categorizing as enforcement versus service? Do we have the right allocations between the budget categories and things like that? But the bottom line is the amount of work. Leave aside Affordable Care Act, leave aside anything that's new, just the volume of returns that are coming in. And I'd say one last point. After this recession, we're seeing more and more people becoming self-employed. You know, they're not being hired back as wage earners. They're either putting themselves into business. And so that issue of, you know, unincorporated self-employed people not reporting becomes a larger issue for our tax gap and our business going forward. There's a huge taxpayer service side on that component too, educating people, being out there, talking to them about their responsibilities, you know, et cetera. It's not just all enforcement that brings in compliance.
Well, I appreciate both of your comments on that topic, and it's one that requires a lot of study and certainly changes from Congress. I would say, Ms. Olson, the biggest upstream factor of all this is, you know, you mentioned dealing with problems upstream and not letting them continue to have to cause problems down the road and have more individuals have to touch it, more staff have to deal with it. The biggest upstream issue, I think, is the complexity of the tax code. If we had a simplified tax code, one in which taxpayers knew the obligations they had, they were very clear and easy to, it would be not only easy for taxpayers, it'd be so much easier on the enforcement side. It would require less people, it would require a smaller budget for the IRS. And so I don't think you're going to see a lot of us say, you know, the answer for tax complexity is we just need more staff, we need more bureaucrats. That's not going to be the angle I think we're going to take, is how do we simplify the code to make it easier on taxpayers and easier to enforce? Mr. George.
Mr. George, because Ms. Olson raised a very important point, and I don't know whether or not this was going to come up later, but one of the unintended consequences of the IRS having to shift people from one function to answer telephone calls, one of the areas in which they do this is especially troubling because they take people who were working identity theft cases, who are working to help identity theft victims, and literally having these individuals stop in midstream and move to telephone answering, how do you complete a return and what have you, and which causes immense delays in helping victims of identity theft, which, as members of this committee know, is a massively growing problem, and especially if you're the subject, if you're the victim involved, is very frustrating. And so it's just a point, again, of it's a zero-sum game. They need resources to do it all. This ACA role, most Americans have no idea of the massive role that the IRS is going to play in the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. And the IRS, once again, will have to make some tough choices as to what to focus upon.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions. I want to make a couple of comments. One, Mr. Yoder, you asked about when could they finalize this rule, and if you look at the Administrative Procedure Act, there's nothing to stop the IRS from finalizing the regulation the day after they have the comment period end. Now, that's not practical, but it's procedurally possible, and we heard the commissioner say that he didn't think that was going to happen. That's kind of his opinion, and I think in light of what Ms. Olson said, I think it's clear with all the implications that has. That would be, I think, outrageous if that were to happen. This needs to be talked about, thought out, discussed, whatever, and I hope that's the plan as they receive these literally 100,000 comments. And the other thing I'd just say, based on, you know, we talk a lot about how much money the IRS needs, and everybody, I talked about it earlier, you need money to provide services. But one of the problems when we get criticized from time to time, people say, well, you're punishing the IRS, but you're really punishing the people. We're not here to punish anybody. We're here when we ask the commissioner, how are you spending the money? And when you look back and you see millions of dollars wasted on lavish conferences, you see the harassment that's gone on. It was back in 2010, I think, that I think the appropriations to the IRS was more than they asked for. And yet that's when all the horseplay and harassment started. In fact, as I recall, some of the money that was being spent on the conferences, since they had a little extra money, they just went ahead and spent it. And then there were times when they would ask for more money, the enforcement would be asking for more money while money was being wasted somewhere else. So I don't think this subcommittee or the Appropriations Committee ever wants to punish anybody, but I think this committee wants to make sure that, just like your role, Ms. Olson, that we're advocates for the taxpayer. And when we see the money being misspent or spent on the wrong priorities, and as Mr. Yoder said, it might be nice to simplify the tax code. If you got it really simple, you wouldn't even need the IRS anymore. You have a fair tax, as they say. But I don't know whether it's harder to appropriate more money to the IRS or to simplify the tax code. Neither one of them is very easy. But we're actually working on both of them. That I just want to make those comments. Mr. Serrano, do you have any final questions or comments?
No taxes, good tax. Actually, I have 3 questions that I'm going to briefly put into one question. One is about you. How do the taxpayers make their way to you? How can we better make taxpayers aware of your existence? Because you have a lot to offer, and yet, you know, the advocate is not seen on a daily basis or heard from, except maybe before Congress. That's one. Secondly, I understand that you started your career with the Earned Income Tax Credit. So could you tell us a little bit about that program? Because that takes a lot of grief in Congress also, because sometimes people get it who don't deserve it, and you know, how does that compare to all the other people who are overseas and in other places who don't pay any taxes at all? So that's the question in a couple of parts.
First, in terms of getting in touch with us, as you all have mandated in the law, we have one office at least in each state. And I have to thank you for that, because we are probably the only part of the IRS that really has one office in each state. And we try to keep the cases that are worked, that arise in the state, in our office. I guess there's an exception right now for Florida, because we are so inundated with identity theft that my employees in Florida would only work identity theft cases, and I think they would kill themselves if that's all they were doing. So we spread some of them out throughout the United States. And my local taxpayer advocates work very closely. They're in the news. They work with local media to make sure that the groups know about us, taxpayers know about us, and they have a requirement to reach out to at least 40 grassroots groups in their locale every single year, and 40 different ones, to let them know about us, whether it's domestic violence shelters, homeless shelters, small business groups, you know. They go to trade associations for truckers. It's very creative what they do to let people know. So we can always do more. We enjoy working through the congressional offices, and we're getting more information out about our organization, getting you all some posters and brochures. I would say about the Earned Income Tax Credit that in my testimony for today, we shared some information, some recent results of IRS audit data that shows the sources of the error. We have the improper payment rate, but what's really important in order to move that improper payment rate, lower it, are understanding what are causing these errors. You know, how much of it is fraud, but how much of it is just the complexity of the statute. And it also helps the IRS learn how to educate taxpayers better, go after preparers. One of the things that we know is that unenrolled preparers, the category of preparers who are the ones that are not CPAs, attorneys, or enrolled agents, you know, just anybody can hang up a shingle, they prepare the vast majority of EITC returns that are prepared by preparers. About 60% of EITC returns are prepared by preparers, and 75% of those prepared returns are prepared by these unregulated people. One thing that I would like to say about the EITC, I know that we focus on the improper payment rate, but the EITC, to administer it, costs about 1% of all of it's a very low-cost program for the IRS to administer. And that contrasts to food stamps or welfare or anything like that, which has caseworkers, et cetera. Food stamps and welfare may have a lower error rate. Where we have our high costs is in the improper payment rate. But if you look at error and costs of administration, it really evens out. I'm not defending the improper payment rate, and I have real pragmatic suggestions about how to address that. But I'm just saying, to put it in context, there's a cost one way or another in these kinds of benefit programs. And it's cheap to administer it through the Internal Revenue Code, but the cost is on the improper payment side.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both. If that answers the question, kind of time has expired. Thank you all. It was a time, we're having such a good time, time just flew by. But thanks for being here. Thanks for all the work you do. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.